When this Ray-worshing field goal secured a season-opening victory for the San Francisco 49ers in 1980, it was the opening act of a story of dominance that would weave its way through the 1980s. Along the way, no team has claimed more divisional titles. It's been a decade of drama and thrills. The 49ers burst into the national consciousness on a January afternoon in 1982 with this Joe Montana to Dwight Clark touchdown pass against Dallas. It is simply known as the catch. No other team in the 80s has won 3 Super Bowl titles. That first title came against Cincinnati in Super Bowl XVI. The 49ers, coming off their first winning season in 5 years, showed that they were a team of destiny with a 26-20 victory. But talk of a dynasty would have to wait. For the 1980s, more wins than any other franchise. The second world title featured a brazen display of the 49ers' awesome offense. Montana and Roger Craig accounted for 4 touchdowns and a 38-16 romp over Miami. No team in the 80s with more yardage. A 49er dynasty was decreed in Super Bowl XXIII. The game was decided on the final drive in the final seconds, just the way Montana and company liked it. No team has scored as many points in the 80s. And the 3 biggest guns in the 49er arsenal are on hand tonight. Joe Montana, the quarterback of the 1980s, Roger Craig, the high-stepping heart of the running attack, and Jerry Rice, the game-breaking wide receiver. Tonight, they meet the talent-laden New Orleans defense as the resurgent Saints look for their 4th consecutive victory. It's the New Orleans Saints and the San Francisco 49ers on ABC's Monday Night Football.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 9th episode of 100 Years of the NFL, a historical journey. I hope all of you really enjoyed our last video when we covered the 1981 Cincinnati Bengals, and as I mentioned at the end of the Bengals broadcast that you saw in our last video, that we would switch gears a little bit and we would talk about the San Francisco 49ers, knowing that the 49ers beat the Cincinnati Bengals in Super Bowl XVI. I thought it would be just a little bit of a clever idea just to shake things up a little bit and delve a little bit into the NFC West, into looking into one of the 49ers championship teams that they had during that 14-year stretch between 1981 and 1994 when they won 5 Super Bowls. So that's going to be what we're going to delve into today, as we will actually be talking about the 1989 San Francisco 49ers here on this very special edition of Monday Night Football on 100 Years in the NFL, a historical journey. I hope you really enjoyed that neat little intro that Monday Night Football made during the 1989 season, right before one of the San Francisco 49ers games against the New Orleans Saints halfway through their 89 season. We'll actually be talking about that game they played against the New Orleans Saints on Monday Night Football later when we talk about the 1989 San Francisco 49ers schedule. But as I mentioned, you know, with the 5 Super Bowls that the 49ers won from 1981 to 1994, these were really the reasons why I chose the 1989 San Francisco 49ers instead of one of their other Super Bowls that they won. I thought their 1981 squad, it was a little weak on the running game that year, and it was really Joe Montana's coming out year in 1981, so I just kind of thought that one didn't really make it. 1988, you kind of had that quarterback controversy between Steve Young and Joe Montana, and it kind of cost the 49ers a little bit in the win column that year because they went 10-6 that year, and it just kind of didn't really seem like a really strong year for me, in my opinion, and probably for 49ers fans. Also for their 1994 squad, the reason why I didn't use their 1994 squad is I kind of thought it was more like a super team, really just getting the big-time free agents, you know, Deion Sanders and Ken Norton from the Dallas Cowboys that the 49ers got that year. Just some of those big prize free agents. I didn't really kind of like that it was a super team and it was kind of right in the middle of the Dallas Cowboy dynasty years. I just kind of thought that team didn't really cut it for me, as well as a really bad loss that they had during the regular season that year when they got wonked by the Philadelphia Eagles. I think it was like 40-8 was the score in that game. So that team just didn't make the cut for me, in my opinion. So I had to really choose between their 1984 squad that went 15-1 and their 1989 squad that went 14-2. And I think the reason why I decided to do the 1989 San Francisco 49ers is their 1984 squad. It was a really good team. It was a really good, well-balanced team, both passing, rushing, defense, and all that, but it just didn't really have a whole lot of Hall of Famers on that team. And just that 1989 season, I mean, just San Francisco was just loaded with big-time talent. You know, Joe Montana, Jerry Rice, Charles Haley, Ronnie Lott, and a few others on offense and defense for them. Just, you know, their 1989 was really their prime year. And, you know, as much as the 1984 squad dominated the National Football League, I just thought their 1989 squad was a little bit better, as well as it being one of Joe Montana's MVP years, because in 1984, Dan Marino won the MVP that year, but the 49ers were up to the challenge to stopping them in Super Bowl XIX. So, you know, just I really thought their 89 squad was deserved to be talked about here. But we're going to mention some of the early players, as well as some of their players that they had on their 1994 squad when we kind of delve through the roster a little bit later here in our broadcast. So let's go ahead and let's delve into the story here about the 1989 San Francisco 49ers, and it actually begins in 1981 when the 49ers began their dynasty under head coach Bill Walsh, and the tremendous job that he did in his first few years in San Francisco after taking over the head job in 1979. So prior to winning Super Bowl XVI, the San Francisco 49ers had not reached the playoffs in 9 years. Their last playoff appearance came in 1972, kind of in the years of John Brody and Steve Spurrier, the two quarterbacks that they had during that 3-year stretch from 1970 to 1972. They got to the playoffs every single year, but every single time they lost to the Dallas Cowboys. Every single season, the Cowboys knocked them out of the playoffs in each of those 3 years. But as for Bill Walsh and his really quick turnaround, the 49ers, really they hadn't won a playoff game since 1971. When Bill Walsh took over in 1979, he really just was trying to rebuild the 49ers just in his own way, really introducing that West Coast style of offense that we kind of talked about a little when we talked about the Cincinnati Bengals and what he did with Ken Anderson, try to implement the same thing with Joe Montana and company. And really, when Bill Walsh arrived there in his previous season in 1978, the previous year before Walsh took over, the 49ers had a 10-loss season that year. And in 79 and 80, the San Francisco 49ers had a 2-14 year in 1979, and then in 1980 they went 6-10. So you just kind of saw a little bit of an improvement that year in 1980, but I just don't think a lot of experts really understood how big of a turnaround it was going to be. And as I mentioned about the 1981 Bengals, responding from their 6-10, 49ers, they went 13-3 after their 6-10 season in 1980. They went 13-3 in 1981 and surprised a lot of experts with that great playoff run. Of course, the great catch by Dwight Clark in the NFC Championship game to put them in their first championship game since the 1949 All-American Football Conference championship game. Like I mentioned about the Cleveland Browns when they were the powerhouse team during the 4 years of the All-American Football Conference, as I mentioned about the 49ers being as good as they were, the Browns and 49ers played in the last AAFC championship game in 49, and when the 49ers went to Super Bowl XVI and won that, that was their first championship in franchise history, and it was just really a phenomenal job on Bill Walsh's part, really delivering such a fast and unpredictable turnaround that just stunned a whole lot of NFL experts. But, Bill Walsh, of course, wasn't, just focused on just getting one Super Bowl championship, as really over that 1980s decade, the 49ers established the next dynasty of the NFL. As we talked about the 1970s Steelers, the 1980s were dominated by the San Francisco 49ers. And really, after winning Super Bowl XVI, the 49ers, they won 5 division titles over the next 7 years. And of course, as I mentioned, they beat Super Bowl 1984 NFL MVP Dan Marino in Super Bowl XIX, and then in 1988, as I mentioned as well, they beat the Cincinnati Bengals in Super Bowl XXIII that year. So it was a phenomenal stretch for the San Francisco 49ers over that period. The early years were just kind of Bill Walsh's own mystique a little bit on the 49ers in their 2 Super Bowls in 1981 and 1984, but then just kind of right in the middle, like in the 85 and the 86 years, they kind of just rebuilt their team a little bit by adding newer talent, and by 1989, they had really formed that great dynasty. And of course, a lot of people didn't think that that they were done yet. I remember kind of right at the end of Super Bowl 24, when John Madden and Pat Summerall were doing their post-game thing, John Madden said, I don't know if this is the best 49ers team that we have seen. So, the level of expectation for the 49ers really in that second half of the 1980s, it really centered on how well Bill Walsh had built the system, but then it was his assistants like Mike Holmgren and George Seifert and a few others that really kept the 49ers going until the late 1990s when Steve Young retired at the end of the 1999 season. So it was just a really phenomenal 2-decade stretch for the San Francisco 49ers. But of course, talking about the 1989 49ers here in our broadcast here on 100 Years of the NFL, a historical journey. So what we're going to do here actually is right before I show you some of their highlights of their early years, I want to go through the 1979 to 1984 draft classes for the San Francisco 49ers, and then I'm going to show you a little bit of some of the 49ers highlights during those years under Bill Walsh, and a few of his really key players that he molded during that stretch for San Francisco. So let's go ahead and let's delve into the 49ers drafts here from 1979 to 1984. Now, as I mentioned about with Bill Walsh being hired in 1979, and just, once, he started getting these Hall of Fame, All-Pro, and Pro Bowl players, he really centered what the 49ers were going to be during this stretch here for San Francisco. So in 1979, this was really the 49ers' first really big draft that they grabbed 2 really big players to help them out in their early years. They drafted quarterback Joe Montana from the University of Notre Dame that year in 1979, and they also selected Dwight Clark as well in the 79 draft as well. And both of them just developed that really great chemistry between both of them. And, tragically, recently we lost Dwight Clark to ALS, and just a great NFL legend that, just really began that 49ers dynasty with that great catch in the NFC Championship game. He still lives on in a lot of 49ers hearts that he touched, as well as just played his mind out for in his career. Really, just at the beginning of his career, being one of the best possession receivers in the National Football League. And then when Jerry Rice came in, he kind of became his first mentor. And then it was Jerry Rice who shattered all the receiving records in the National Football League, and he gave Dwight Clark enormous credit for teaching him early on, and just a really great player that Dwight Clark was. Then the next year after that, though, in 1980, the 49ers drafted a key piece on their defense during the 1980s. That was Keena Turner, and they drafted Turner from the University of Purdue. And then also in 1980, they also got two other really key pieces during the 49ers' early Super Bowls. In Super Bowl XVI and Super Bowl XIX, they drafted Earl Cooper, and they also drafted Jim Stuckey as well for their offensive line. Earl Cooper was an important piece of that running back by committee early on in 1981, but then 1984, kind of once they got Wendell Tyler and Roger Craig, it was the two of them that really brought their talents on that 84 squad before the later years when they got Rathman and Craig on the same team. And we'll talk about Craig and Rathman in a little bit here as well. But then in 1981, though, this was really that big draft class that the 49ers really stepped in on, and they really just attempted to really rebuild their defense. They knew that Joe Montana and the offense, were going to be decent at best, but their defense in 1980, it was a really struggling defense, as you're going to see a little bit when I show you some of the regular season highlights. 1981, they just really wanted to address their defense, and they really stepped in with some really big draft picks that year in 1981. Of course, drafting defensive back Ronnie Lott from USC. That was a really big draft pick for them, and the Hall of Famer that he became on that San Francisco 49ers defense. They also drafted another defensive back named Eric Wright, and he was drafted from the University of Missouri that year in 1981. And another cornerback they got was Carlton Williamson, and he was only around for their 1981 and 1984 Super Bowls. But really, those three defensive backs were just huge assets for Bill Walsh and his defensive staff, including George Seifert. It was really those three that really transformed that 49ers defense and really the team's psyche as well, just kind of really bringing this, just new spirit into San Francisco. And that's exactly what they did in 1981 when the 49ers went on their dream turnaround season that year in 81. And then they also addressed their defensive line a little bit as well. They drafted a little-known defensive lineman named Pete Kugler, and he was selected from Penn State University that year in 1981. And Kugler stretched his career on the 49ers dynasty train as well from 1981 to 1989, being a part of all four of the 49ers Super Bowl seasons that they had during their dynasty years of the 1980s. But then in 1982, though, this was a little bit of a strange off year for the San Francisco 49ers. Of course, it was the NFL strike year, and a lot of teams kind of lost the luster a little bit with dealing with the issues within the league and not really getting the big contract extensions that they wanted. It was a really lost year for the 49ers that year in 82, but they still did use the NFL draft really, really well. In 82, they addressed two other key parts of their team. They selected offensive lineman Bubba Paris in the 1982 NFL draft from the University of Michigan, is where they got Paris from, and just once again, just a really important piece of that San Francisco offensive line. We're going to touch base on a few other big offensive linemen in a little while as well when we talk about Guy McIntyre, Harris Barton, and a few other really key pieces of that 49ers defensive line. And then also that year in 1982, 82, they also added another really big piece on that secondary unit. He was only around, though, for the 1984 Super Bowl, I believe, for the 49ers. That was Dana McLemore when they selected him in the 1982 NFL Draft as well. So just think about it. During that 1984 season, you had Ronnie Lott, Eric Wright, Dana McLemore, and you also had Carlton Williamson. So 4 really solid defensive backs that they had that year in 1984. And just a tremendous job. All 4 of them just really brought on that San Francisco 49ers team in 1984. And just kind of like when I saw those 4 cornerbacks there, I was going like, should I have done that 1984 squad? But I just said, you know what, 1989, just the Hall of Famers, I just think was just, a lot better of a team. But that 1984 49ers defense was incredible on what the 4 cornerbacks that they had that year, and just really playing exceptionally well for all of them, really stepping up that year for the San Francisco 49ers. But then the next year after that, though, in 1983, the 49ers kind of got their luster back a little bit. That year they went 10-6 that year and reached the NFC Championship game, but lost to the Washington Redskins that year in 83. But it just kind of really gave the 49ers really that next wave of getting that star quality that they needed in the NFL Draft and in free agency to really help them out over the next 5-6 years when they dominated over that stretch. And in 1983, this is when they selected running back Roger Craig from the University of Nebraska, is where they drafted Craig from that season in 1983, and just a really phenomenal running back that he was, the NFL rushing champion, I believe, in 1988, and just a really important asset of that West Coast style of offense that Bill Walsh really used Craig a lot as a receiving back out of the backfield. And we'll get to that a little bit later when we see some of their regular season highlights. But then also the 49ers also addressed another really important piece of their offensive line as well in 1983. They drafted offensive lineman Jesse Sapolu, and he was selected from the University of Hawaii, and he was a really late round steal for the San Francisco 49ers. I believe he was either like a 10th or 11th round pick that year in 1983, so just really an overlooked draft prospect. But Sapolu was a phenomenal offensive lineman for the 49ers, and just once it, like I said, with Paris and Barton, Guy McKyer, and with Sapolu on that offensive line, just a really solid offensive line to protect Joe Montana in the later years when they got Steve Young. Just a really phenomenal job by Bill Walsh and his management, just really finding these guys and really plugging them in and just really letting them, just run the show. And they just did a phenomenal job building that offensive lineup over those first few years when Bill Walsh finally took over the head coaching position in 1979. And by 1983, just a really solid team that he put together that year in 83. But then also in that 83 draft class as well, they kind of added 2 other really important pieces as well on their team. They selected another important defensive player named Tom Holmoe, and he was a 3-time Super Bowl champion for the San Francisco 49ers. He was on their 84, 88, and 89 team, but unfortunately in their 89 team he just really didn't do as much as some of the other defensive players for the San Francisco 49ers, but I thought I should include him in because as Bill Walsh really said in one of his America's Game moments of the highlights that they showed, he said, it's 49 guys. Everybody plays on this team. If you don't have a role, you're going to get one. And just, when your time comes, you have to step up and you have to do what's in best interest of the team. And, some of these guys really did perform well, and it really took that message to heart during Bill Walsh's tenure, and then George Seifert kind of kept the same attitude going when he became the head coach in 1989 as well. And they also selected another important piece of their offensive line. They drafted Ricky Ellison, and his son was Rhett Ellison, who was the tight end for the Minnesota Vikings, and then also a few years ago with the New York Giants. But his father was a member of some of the 49ers Super Bowl teams of the 1980s. And a really interesting stat here on Ricky Ellison is he started 63 of 64 games from 1983 to 1986. So he was only around for their Super Bowl XIX team, but still just a really important piece, though, of that offensive line for San Francisco that year in 1984. But then that very next year, though, in 1984, really, once again, just really getting those key pieces for the 49ers 15-1 season. They had in 84 winning that Super Bowl XIX over Dan Marino and company. But in 1984, draft class still really finding these really important gems here for San Francisco. They drafted offensive lineman Guy McIntyre, as I talked about earlier about the 49ers offensive line. They got McIntyre from the University of Georgia, and they also addressed their defensive line as well. They drafted defensive lineman Michael Carter, and he was selected from the University of Southern Methodist, is where they got Michael Carter from that season in 1984. And they also selected another important piece of that secondary as well. They drafted Jeff Fuller, who was another three-time Super Bowl champion for the 49ers. He had his years from 1984 to 1989, really helping out that 49ers secondary as a backup defensive end for him as well. And they also selected tight end John Frank, who scored a touchdown in the 1988 NFC Championship game for the San Francisco 49ers. And then in that same draft as well, they drafted another offensive lineman named Todd Shell, and he was actually the 49ers' first-round pick that season in 1984. And he made 13 starts for the 49ers in 1985. So a really solid job by Bill Walsh and his management staff, really just finding these players from that 6-year stretch from 1979 to 1984, really building the 49ers' early years in which they dominated for their 2 Super Bowl seasons in 1981 and 1984.
I don't think anybody can go into the stadium against us and feel safe with a victory.
By 1980, Bill Walsh's 49ers were putting fans in the stands and points on the board.
Montana throwing to Solomon. He got it. Touchdown, San Francisco.
The problem was his ever-changing secondary couldn't keep opponents out of the end zone.
We went through like 30-something defensive backs. I mean, they quit writing the guys' names on their helmets, with the white adhesive tape with the name across the front. They stopped it because it wasn't worth the time. It wasn't worth the waste of tape because the guys, they wouldn't make it to lunch.
I guess at some point, Bill Walsh just said, I've had enough. And he decided he was going to get his secondary all at once. In the first round, he took Ronnie Lott.
From USC, rookie Ronnie Lott.
In the second round, he took Eric Wright.
From Missouri, rookie Eric Wright.
And in the third round, he took Colton Williamson.
From Pittsburgh, rookie Carlton Williamson.
Dwight Hicks was the veteran of that group. He had been cut by a few teams, was working in a health food store, and got another break. I'm sure there were some veterans that were saying, what the hell is he doing? Drafting these guys, he's just going to stick them in there. We're throwing away this year.
Pull it down. There you go. Catch it in the air and then rebound.
George Seifert's a defensive back coach, and it's his mission.
Go up in the air, Ron.
That these guys are going to know what they're doing.
Up in the air. There we go, Carlton. Get up in the air now.
They'd be in the meeting rooms longer than anybody else. They'd get there before everybody else, and they'd leave after everybody else.
We were going to kidnap George, and we were going to take him and try to bury him. I need to train you guys. I need to get you guys in shape. We would go on long trips running through the streets. Can you imagine an NFL team running through the streets of their community, getting in shape? That's what we were doing with George Seifert. That's what he said. I'm working with you guys step by step.
Another key to the developing secondary was Seifert's new assistant, former 49er defensive back Ray Rhodes.
Ray Rhodes, then and to this day, has a defensive swagger and attitude that those four, specifically those four young guys, fed off.
Having Ray Rhodes and having George Seifert, having Cornell University, which George Seifert was the head coach, and having the NFL University. What we got is a combination of street and a combination of academia. Ray would say, I want everybody in the stands to go woo. So, well, what do you mean by that? He goes, everybody stands up when they see woo. I said, well, what? You got to give a woo lick.
Let's hit him like we always do. Let's fly at him, baby. Ready?
No turning back.
All of a sudden, we came up with a new term, woo lick. Can you imagine? That's not at Cornell University.
Teams tend to get remembered for their play and their personality. And I think our defense didn't have a personality that people could focus in on. We always seemed to run into a team that had a sexier story about them that everybody could relate to. We didn't have anything like that.
Fifth-year pro Keena Turner, number 58, was the only 49er to play every defensive down. Turner was a perfectionist. He was often unsparing in his self-criticism.
It got to a point where it wasn't ever good enough the way you played personally because you were always thinking about the tackle you missed or the play that you didn't make. I could be up at 3 in the morning waxing my car after a game because I missed a tackle. I think it went back to just that relentless look for some perfection in the way that you played. And yes, the downside of searching for perfection is you never ever get there.
Turner's search didn't really begin until 1981. That's when Jack Hacksaw Reynolds, number 64, joined the team. The veteran linebacker was eccentric, but totally committed to football. Turner was impressed.
As a young player coming in, I didn't realize that being a good athlete had nothing to do with being a good football player. And I just learned how to be a football player around Hack. His approach to the game was one of being a student throughout. He came to every meeting with a shoebox full of pencils. He had a divider down the middle. He had sharpened pencils on one side, dull pencils on the other, and he just kept changing them as he wrote down every single thing that was said in the meeting. And that was a demeaning approach that I didn't know and wasn't used to and didn't think that that had anything to do with being a football player. And I learned that from Jack.
You did big splits over here. You rammed the nose over on here. I was over here.
Play off, Dwight. Yeah. Read what you see.
His approach was artful and creative. Football was an art to him.
Pretty. And that will be a beauty. Football.
It wasn't just this entanglement of bodies that physically, play after play, proved who was the stronger man, who was the better man. Bill's approach was who was the smarter man.
The way he would motivate people, either through fear or he had this one little thing that he used to do that we found out later was all set up, but he would scream at the assistant coach, come down and get in the assistant coach's face and say, "What the hell are you doing? You can't get this Clark kid to play any better than that. I'm getting rid of your butt. Get this guy playing better."
Wait a minute. Just wait a second. The halfback crosses that way on a double circle out? Right. Well, let me... Fullback goes to the flat. Fullback goes to the flat? I put the play in, Paul. You correct me on the field. I put the thing in upstairs. Now I'm being told by you what the to do. Let's go.
You just kind of listen to that stuff as you're going along, but you didn't know it was all set up until, I got upstairs and heard, oh, that was all fake. He was screaming at my coach, and he was told in the meeting before that he was going to get screamed at. That's pretty smart, but I can't believe I fell for it. He had that dry sense of humor that would come across in the meeting.
We've got to have everybody 100% fresh for this ballgame. Somehow you've got to be fresh. In some cases it may mean a lot of sex, in others none. I don't know.
I really enjoy the humor.
And Danny White, he knows he's not going to play, so he's the guy mouthing off. We're going to kick your ass. You know?
I think it was easy to believe Bill Walsh because he would tell you things that would happen. We're going to run this play against this defense. When you catch it, there won't be anybody within 10 yards of you. That would happen in the game, and you'd catch the ball and get ready to get hit and turn around, and there's nobody there. He would do those kind of things over and over with his designing of plays.
Here he goes back to pass, looking down toward the end zone, open to Solomon. He's got it. No one was on Solomon. No one was within 10 yards of him.
You just got to the point where everything he said, you just believe this is the way it's going to be. This is the way it's going to happen.
So if it's not there, you just time to throw it.
If I hadn't fouled, though, I had him.
Sometimes football players have that stigma of the dumb football jock. But in Bill Walsh's offense, you couldn't be the dumb football jock. All I knew was a 10-yard hook was run 10 yards and hook. In the West Coast offense, a 10-yard hook could be a cross versus man-to-man. If he has inside coverage, it's sliding back outside. If it's man-to-man under, you're looping out and around.
And he got it for a touchdown for San Francisco.
To me, that's what made the West Coast offense really, really difficult.
Having the ability to change routes, change the depth of your route, given the fact that a defense is running a certain defense, believe me, it is not fair. There were times that George Seifert and I, we would sit there and look at some of these patterns and we'd go, yeah, that's going to be hard to stop.
Damn it, in 1981, football was smash mouth. Football was the NFC East, and it was coming off the ball, and it was beating people up. And if you didn't do that, that wasn't really football. Suddenly, we were dancing and moving and jabbing and doing things people considered unmanly and not quite right.
You know the quarterback's coming to here.
Look at a chessboard, a conventional chessboard. Now take that same chessboard and a la Star Trek or Star Wars, where a chessboard now has 4 different tiers that's on like a diagonal like this, and you've got a board here, a board here, a board here, and a board here. We were playing the same game as everybody else. We were just playing on a couple different levels.
Solomon, he's got it. He's at the 10, the 5. A touchdown for San Francisco.
We believed he knew something nobody else knew. We knew we had an advantage having him as our coach.
The first time I met Joe Montana, it was our first mini camp. I checked into the hotel and went over to the Howard Johnson's restaurant. This guy walks in, sits down at the other side of the counter. He got long blonde hair and he's got a Fu Manchu, just tiny little legs. Doesn't look very athletic at all. So I'm looking at him thinking, well, that might be a player, but if it is, it's probably a kicker. When he walks on the field, it's like he puts the cape on and the S on the chest.
You hear the analogy all the time is given about a, sort of a quiet killer, a quiet assassin.
A lot like Clint Eastwood. Didn't have to say a lot. He just had that way about himself.
Tell Freddie to split about.
People naturally assume, and I think falsely, that Joe was just an extension of Bill. Joe had the ability to improvise. And I'm not sure if improvisation was something that Bill had initially built into his plan. But suddenly now he's the guy that, from an improv standpoint, would be like comparing your average comedian to Robin Williams. Joe could riff on the football field amazingly. And he could take a lot of what Bill wanted to do and sort of put his own spin on it.
Just as fine a pass as you're going to see, I'll tell you.
He wasn't a great player at Notre Dame just by passing through town. His greatness shows up. It showed up there, and it showed up since he probably first put on a male supporter.
Joe Montana received much of the credit for the 49ers' newfound success, and he accepted most of the blame when things went wrong.
Fumbled snaps were always the quarterback's fault.
If there was a bad snap, Bill or the offensive line coach would be quick to yell at the center, and Joe would immediately say, that was my fault. I pulled out too quick.
Interceptions, bad throws, big hits, that was Joe's fault.
And I think that's why all of his teammates loved him so much, supported him so much, and played their ass off for him.
Welcome back, everybody, to 100 Years of the NFL, a historical journey. I hope you enjoyed watching some of the San Francisco 49ers early highlights of the 1980 through 1984 years, introducing to some of the really key pieces of those teams: Keena Turner, Dwight Clark, and Dwight Hicks, and a few other really key pieces of the 49ers early years in the 1980s. We also saw a little bit of Randy Cross and Dwight Clark kind of talking about the West Coast style of offense that Bill Walsh used in those early years with the San Francisco 49ers. But as we're going to get to later when we talk about their 1989 squad, when they really started getting the bigger, talented players like the Jerry Rices and the John Taylors, and getting the new guys in, the West Coast offense was really taken to a whole another level by a new set of the coaching staff that was really mentored by Bill Walsh in those early years with the 49ers before really capping off their dynasty with their 1989 season. So what we're going to do here is right before I show you a few more of the 49ers highlights from 1985 to 1988 over that 4-year stretch, we're going to take a look at a few other really big draft picks and really big free agents that the 49ers management really found over that next 4-year stretch, and then we'll start to finally delve into the 1989 49ers key offensive players, statistics, and their schedule right after we delve into the rest of the 49ers drafts here. So after winning Super Bowl XIX against the Miami Dolphins in 1985 in that NFL draft, the 49ers management with Bill Walsh and company, they landed two more really big pieces for their 1989 squad. Of course, the biggest draft pick of the 49ers draft class that year in 85 was wide receiver Jerry Rice, selected from Mississippi Valley State in the first round of that 1985 draft, and just an incredible steal that Jerry Rice was. I mean, just you think a lot about these big, high-profile receivers, and you kind of think, like maybe they're like FBS schools. You think like the powerhouses like Alabama and Tennessee, Florida, even Miami. But Jerry Rice, though, a really unknown FCS product from Mississippi Valley State, and just he made a huge splash for the 49ers, and a lot of people consider him as the greatest receiver of all time in NFL history, bar none. And just it's amazing to me how the 49ers were able to get this guy from an FCS level school and just have him turn into the greatest receiver in NFL history. Just an incredible story from the perspective of Jerry Rice. And then also in that 1985 draft class, they also added one more really key piece to their offensive line as well. They selected offensive lineman Bruce Collie in the third round of the 1985 draft. They selected him from the University of Texas at Arlington in that 1985 draft. So just those two really helped out that 49ers offense in such big ways later in the 1980s. I mean, early in their careers, they kind of just found themselves as backups. Of course, Rice was a backup to Dwight Clark, and Bruce Collie really kind of didn't get his chance with just really that solid offensive line, as we mentioned earlier, with some of the really other big pieces of that 49ers offensive line unit in the early 1980s. But then once the late 1980s came along, Bruce Collie and Jerry Rice were full-time starters by the start of the 1989 season. So two really good finds here for the 49ers in 1985. Then in 1986, this was just another really strong draft here by the 49ers. And as I mentioned about with the 1970 Dolphins and the 1971 Steelers draft classes, kind of getting those really big, important players for those two teams to set the stage for their two seasons, as we talked about with the 1972 Dolphins and the 1978 Steelers, how those two drafts for them really worked out. It was the 49ers 1986 draft that they really got their next big batch of players that they were able to really put into the system in that 1989 season and just really become big contributing pieces for the 49ers that season for San Francisco. So in 1986, they landed some really big defensive linemen for their defense with George Seifert and company. They selected defensive lineman Larry Roberts from the University of Alabama that year. They also selected future Hall of Fame defensive end Charles Haley from James Madison University in that same draft in 1986. And then one more big defensive lineman they drafted was Kevin Fagan, and he was selected from the University of Miami in that 1986 draft for the 49ers. So then in their secondary unit, they really got two other really big playmakers as well, really to join Ronnie Lott in that San Francisco 49ers secondary. And those two players were defensive back Don Griffin, who was selected from Middle Tennessee State that year in 86. And then the other really big piece, 49ers fans will kind of remember this name a little bit more, Tim McKyer, who was also selected in that 1986 draft. And he was also a University of Texas at Arlington prospect as well. So they got McKyer and Bruce Collie from Texas Arlington in two straight drafts, and both of them, were really key pieces for the San Francisco 49ers secondary and offensive line units. So just jumping on that FCS bandwagon for the 49ers really in two straight years for San Francisco 49ers management, just really finding these really big pieces for the 49ers defense and offense. And then also talking about offense here a little bit, in 1986 they got two other really big pieces for their offense in this draft as well. They drafted running back Tom Rathman from the University of Nebraska, who was the 49ers starting fullback for their 1989 season. And also they got another really big piece for their 1989 squad. He spent many years as Jerry Rice's battery mate right next to him with Joe Montana and Steve Young. They selected wide receiver John Taylor in the 1986 draft. And once again, another FCS product. John Taylor actually went to Delaware State University, and that's where the 49ers got Taylor from. So it's just amazing to me that they got two really big, talented receivers that were either all-pro or Pro Bowl type wide receivers, and both of them came from FCS schools. So it's just amazing to me to just kind of just see what the 49ers management was doing during the 1980s, trying to just build their team with just really unique college prospects, and they really did a phenomenal job over those years in the mid-1980s to really center what their next part of the 49ers dynasty was going to be like in their two Super Bowls in 1988 and 1989. So after the 1985 and 1986 seasons, the 49ers were actually bounced out of the playoffs in both years by the New York Giants in those 2 years. But then in 1987, this was a really interesting year here for the San Francisco 49ers, both draft-wise and also in free agency this season. In the 1987 draft, another really big offensive lineman that they got in that draft was offensive lineman Harris Barton from North Carolina, and he was another really big important piece on that 49ers offensive line, as I mentioned, with Bruce Collie and also with Guy McIntyre and then Harris Barton as well. Really, those three, and then also Jesse Sapolu, as we talked about as well. Really, those four were really, really big, important pieces for that 49ers offensive line to really gel into really one of the best offensive lines in the National Football League in 1989. But it was that same year, though, in 1987 as well. Excuse me, that the 49ers also acquired quarterback Steve Young. They traded with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that offseason and were able to land Hall of Famer Steve Young from them to serve as Joe Montana's backup quarterback. And, you know, everyone kind of talks about the rivalry between those two quarterbacks in those years that both of them were in San Francisco. It really started with that trade that the 49ers made to Tampa Bay. And a lot of people really kind of felt it was a bit of a safe move at the time because Montana had not really been as great of the quarterback as he was in the early 1980s. He kind of struggled with injuries in 85 and 86, and Walsh decided to really land Steve Young, but Steve Young then found out that he would be the backup with Joe Montana starting to collect back-to-back MVP awards in 1989 and 1990. He just started to say, you know what, maybe this wasn't the best decision, but Young still showed a lot of talent, and when we get to their 1989 schedule, you're going to be a little surprised at how much playing time Steve Young actually got that season in 1989, and it really began in 1987 with that strike-shortened year with the NFL playing only 15 games that year, but Young saw a lot of playing time for the 49ers during that year for them in 87, so it just kind of really kicked off that quarterback controversy between both of them. So in 1987, though, the 49ers, they had a phenomenal season that year. They finished 13-2, but were absolutely stunned in that playoff game against the Minnesota Vikings. A lot of 49ers fans want to forget that playoff loss in 1987, and I think a lot of them could have easily said that could have been almost our fifth Super Bowl title. If you almost really think about it, the 49ers had made the Super Bowl that season. They could have almost three-peated in that stretch from 1987 to 1989, and also if Roger Craig had not fumbled the football in the 90 NFC Championship game against the Giants, could have been a four-peat for the 49ers, and then that's just amazing to really think about that, but that's how close the 49ers could have almost come to winning 4 straight NFL championships from 1987 to 1990. So just a really great streak for the 49ers in those final years of the 1980s and the early 1990s as well. But then after getting bounced, though, in the 1987 playoffs, in the 1988 NFL draft, they also really did some other really big key prospects that the 49ers got in the 1988 NFL draft. They drafted defensive back Chet Brooks from Texas A&M, and they also got another really big piece on their defensive line as well. They selected Pierce Holt from Angelo State University in Texas that season in 1988, and he became a really important piece of that defensive line for the 49ers in 1989 opposite of Hall of Famer Charles Haley. Both of them really did really big jobs there for the San Francisco 49ers that season. And they also selected a key special teamer for the 49ers in 1989. They selected punter Barry Helton from the University of Colorado as well in 1988 as well. And there were also, I forgot to mention, there were also a few more big draft picks that the San Francisco 49ers got in the other draft classes that really weren't the big-time starters for the 49ers in 1989, but I really felt it was important to single them out and really tell you like how important they were for the 49ers in later years. In that 1986 draft, as I talked about, really that big draft where the 49ers got really like 7 really great draft prospects in that draft. They also selected offensive lineman Steve Wallace, who was a Pro Bowler on the 49ers offensive line in 1992. He didn't really become a true starter for the San Francisco 49ers until really Steve Young became the quarterback for the 49ers in 1990. And also in that 1987 draft, when they drafted Harris Barton from North Carolina, they also selected a little-known running back prospect. They drafted Terrence Flagler, who served as the 49ers' primary kick returner in 1989 and really did a pretty decent job in the 49ers special teams unit that season in 89. When we go over their statistics, I will tell you a little bit about Flagler there. And then also in that 88 draft class as well, they also selected linebacker Bill Romanowski. A lot of people talk about that guy as really being one of those journeyman linebackers that had so much success in the teams that he had. He played for the 49ers, the Denver Broncos, the Raiders, even in the later part of his career. Just a really solid Pro Bowl linebacker that Bill Romanowski was. And that also in that 88 draft class, they also drafted defensive lineman Danny Stubbs as well to really help out with the youth movement in the San Francisco defense, really trying to find younger prospects to replace some of the older players for the San Francisco 49ers in those drafts in the later years of the 1980s as well. And then also one other really big free agency pickup that the 49ers had also in 1987 was tight end Brent Jones as well, who was a really big piece of that 49ers offense as well. Of course, John Taylor and Jerry Rice got really most of the attention, but Brent Jones was a really big free agent pickup for the 49ers. I believe he was actually selected by the Pittsburgh Steelers actually in 1986, but then he was a training camp cut and really spent the 86 season out of football. But then in 87, the 49ers signed him, and he really became a really important tight end for Joe Montana and Steve Young to throw to in his career with both of those great Hall of Fame quarterbacks here for the 49ers.
Brent Jones is a Bay Area native. He was born in San Jose and attended Santa Clara. He didn't grow up a 49ers fan because in those days, the 49ers were a team no one could love. From 1973 through 1981, the 49ers had just one winning season.
I remember my parents got a 49er jacket for my brother, and my mom tried to get him to wear it to school, and he cried. And she said, "Why don't you want to wear your 49er jacket?" And he said, "Because they're losers." And that was it. That was what I grew up around, in the 49ers. And then all of a sudden, in 81, they won the Super Bowl championship. In 84, they came back and did it again. So by the time I joined the 49ers in 87, there was an expectation that this was a win it all or don't even show up.
Jones was signed by the 49ers as a free agent. In 1987, he went to training camp as a backup to Pro Bowl tight end Russ Francis.
When I came to camp the next year, I was so excited because Tom Rathman was one of my good buddies, and we had it all set up. We were going to room together. 2 days before camp, Mike Holmgren called me, and he said, "You're going to room with Steve Young." I said, "Coach, no, you don't understand. I've got this all set up. Tom Rathman's my roommate." And he said, "No, you're going to room with Steve Young." I said, "Coach, no, me and Rathman, we have it all figured out. I'm bringing the refrigerator. He's bringing the TV." And he said, "I don't think you get it. I'm telling you, you are rooming with Steve Young." And we got to know each other the next couple weeks. I was a guy that wanted to become a starter. And obviously he did as well, but he was behind Hall of Fame quarterback and just kind of sitting there biding his time. And we really started talking about, kind of hopes and dreams. It was almost like two 10-year-olds sitting around on their bed, laying around in between practices tired. Hey, yeah, we're going to be great one day.
The man in front of Young was already great. Joe Montana was an icon in San Francisco when Young arrived in 1987.
What the 49ers were at that point in time was really a team in transition. They were transitioning out of the teams that had won the Super Bowl in 1981 and 1984, and they were bringing in younger players. So, Jerry Rice was replacing a Dwight Clark. I was replacing a Keith Farnhorst. They had brought Steve Young in. Steve Young came in 1987 as well, and they wanted to work him in too as part of this transition.
In just his second season with the team, Young refused to live in the legend's shadow.
There's a lot of tension with Steve coming to the 49ers. Steve would get really mad. Really wanted to show that he's worthy, he can play.
Everyone wants to play. I want to play desperately, and I'm going to try to drive everyone nuts till they give me a shot. I don't think anyone wants to sit the bench, and that's very much the case for myself.
This is the first time Joe would have to basically compete, have somebody over his shoulder. So there was a lot of tension.
At age 32, Joe Montana knows this is a crucial year.
You got a young guy pushing you in town now, Steve Young. How do you handle this?
We have to be as competitive as possible without letting it come between us.
It never got where these guys wouldn't speak or talk to each other. They had to talk to each other. They kept it professional.
If Joe was upset at anybody, it would have been me, not Steve Young. Joe was having problems physically. Because of that, Steve saw some action.
Like most offensive linemen, Harris Barton was not a household name when he entered the NFL.
I was drafted by the 49ers in 1987, and I'll never forget, I'm watching on ESPN in a restaurant in North Carolina, University of North Carolina, and the commissioner of the league gets on and announces my name.
49ers first choice, Harris Burton, offensive tackle, North Carolina.
Harris Burton. And I'm like, well, that's a good way to start. I got drafted, and the next afternoon I was flying on a plane right out to San Francisco. Never been to San Francisco before. Got off the plane, and an hour later I'm standing in the huddle with some of the best football players in the world. To my right is Joe Montana, and to my left is Jerry Rice and Roger Craig and Tom Rathman, and that happened in a 24-hour period. I realized that, hey, I'm not in North Carolina. I'm with the World Championship 49ers. I was born and raised in a Jewish family in Atlanta, Georgia. I went way beyond my physical abilities. I had to use a lot of mental strength, and I was never a player that, I'm a nice guy, and I had to spend the entire week really psyching myself up to go out there and do battle.
He was a nervous body, though. He's a worrier, during the game, he would always say, "Is my technique okay?" He's prancing around in the locker room, working on his technique, his blocking techniques.
We had to sort of protect Harris because he would worry. He'd worry about things. And the other players knew it, so they'd find reason to get him to worry.
I say, Harris, you better be ready this week. You're going against Lawrence Taylor, so it just make him that much more nervous.
We've set a high standard for this ball club, the highest in football, maybe the highest football is seen, and we're not going to deteriorate regardless of who's in the game. Because the guy next to you suffers if you don't give it everything you've got.
The thing that you never want to do as a player with the 49ers is you never want to let the other guys down.
You cannot let down because you're obligated to the men sitting next to you tonight. You can't let down.
One of the first speeches Bill gave every year was, anybody who carries a football for the San Francisco 49ers was an extension of everybody else in this room. So Roger Craig, you carry the football. You're an extension of Harris Barton, who's blocking for you. You're an extension of Joe Montana, who hands the ball off to you. You're an extension of Michael Carter, who's playing defense. You're an extension of the fans of San Francisco. You're an extension of the guy who's cleaning your uniform. We give you that type of respect when we hand you the football.
We were an extension to each other, and we believed in that. My responsibility for play action faking and things like that was just as big as Jerry Rice or John Taylor catching touchdown balls. It was such a team thing.
It's not our athletic ability that's going to go out and knock the jocks off these guys. It's how we play as a team. I know they all want to win badly, they want to beat us, but damn it, they can't do it because we play better as a unit than they do.
We know we're the best team. Let's just go out and prove it.
To build team unity, Bill Walsh created the annual 49er Fishing Derby.
Our facility in the training camp had a pond. It was pretty large. Going by it one day on my bike, I thought, wait a minute, if there were fish in there, we could have a fishing derby.
So what they're going to do is stock this thing with fish tomorrow. And Friday we're going to have a barbecue. Everybody will have a pole. I don't want any pole fights, anything like that.
We filled that thing with catfish, and everybody got a rod. We had teams, the defensive backs versus the offensive line. We had individual prizes. We had a catfish feed that night. So it turned out to be quite a tradition.
They stocking it with trout, right? Catfish.
Walsh's stocking of the pond with catfish was a source of unintentional humor to the team. For catfish was the nickname of starting running back Roger Craig.
If you hook Roger, you don't get the $100.
Freddie Solomon named me Catfish. When I run through the holes, my eyes expand. It's not that I'm afraid to get hit or anything. I like to see where I'm going. So I just swim through the holes, you know?
Craig's nickname became a punchline for the former boxer, Coach Walsh.
He had this artist draw a picture of me looking like a catfish with bug eyes, you know, with 33 on, you know, swimming through the hole. The team just crack up laughing, you know, so this is a way of loosening us up for a big game, and he was known for that.
Craig's superhero-like strength changed the perception of the 49ers as a finesse team. So did his high-knee running style.
I was a high hurdler in high school and in college, and my coach in high school used to tell me, get your knees up. We used to run through those tires, you know. You got to get your knees up or else you'll fall on your face. In one game in high school, I knocked out like three guys in the same game. You know, lifting your knees up is kind of like a weapon for me because people didn't shy away from tackling me. I used it to my advantage.
His versatility was a perfect fit for Walsh's complex schemes.
Coach Walsh, he utilized me better than any coach ever utilized me.
We want to get Roger the ball. We're going to flood one side and get Roger out, and the whole idea here now.
Whenever he wanted me to do something, I was going to make sure I was going to be there for him.
We know that this guy will have to cover Roger, which is scary for them.
He would always give some type of positive reinforcement.
Because Roger's had some great days catching the ball.
Welcome back, everybody, to 100 Years of the NFL, a historical journey. I hope you really enjoyed watching some of the San Francisco 49ers highlights from their 1985 through 1988 seasons, kind of introducing a few more of the really key players of the San Francisco 49ers later years of the 1980s, as we got a chance to see Roger Craig, Harris Barton, Brent Jones, Steve Young coming in 1987, and a few other really big, important playmakers on the 49ers offense and defensive sides of the football, as we also discussed with their draft classes from 1981 to 1988, as Bill Walsh and his staff really did a phenomenal job over that 7-8-year stretch, really bringing the 49ers to their dynasty. But then in 1989, though, it was just a phenomenal season that just really capped off a tremendous turnaround decade for the San Francisco 49ers after a really disappointing end to the 1970s. The 1980s was truly their chance to be put on the NFL pedestal with all the great Hall of Famers that were on those 49ers teams of the 1980s. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to take a quick look here at some of the other key offensive and defensive players here for the 1989 San Francisco 49ers. And an interesting note here is that, as we saw with Bill Walsh, of course, he was the head coach for the 49ers from 1981 to 1988. Well, after winning those Super Bowl XXIII, Walsh announced his retirement from the National Football League. He just kind of really, I felt, was maybe a little bit burned out, or maybe just kind of the 1988 season kind of just took a bit of a toll on him, but he left it, though, in some really good hands, though, in 1989, as defensive coordinator George Seifert was then brought up as the San Francisco 49ers head coach, and he had been an assistant defensive coach with Bill Walsh when the 1980s began. But then during the mid-1980s, though, he then earned the job as defensive coordinator under Bill Walsh during those really strong years in the later years of the 1980s. After a little bit of a struggling issue in 1985 and 1986, Seifert did a really good job over 1987 and 1988, just kind of bringing that defense back to what it was in 1981 and 1984. So really, when he got the head coaching job in 1989, though, it was a really big challenge for Seifert to really see what he could do with, you know, this team that only had 10 wins in 1988, but he had a lot in store with his offensive coordinator being Mike Holmgren, who later coached the Seattle Seahawks and the Green Bay Packers to Super Bowl appearances, and he also had another pretty good coaching staff that was left with him, and he also was able to pick up a few really big guys in free agency as well, as we'll get to when we look at some of the highlights from the San Francisco 49ers 1989 season in just a little bit. So, like I said, though, what we're going to do here is we're just going to look at a few more key offensive and defensive players here, and then after that, we're going to kind of talk a little bit about some of the key offensive and defensive statistics, and then I'll kind of lead you in a little bit into the backstory of the San Francisco 49ers 1989 season, and then after that, we'll finally delve into their schedule a little bit and see how dominant the San Francisco 49ers were in that 1989 season when they went 14-2. So, as for the 49ers' key offensive players, we kind of talked a lot about some of their really big key players on the offense, with really accounting for the draft. We talked about, of course, Joe Montana being the star quarterback that he was, but his backup quarterback, though, Steve Young, in 1989, though, he got a little bit of playing time in 1989, as he also did early in his career when he was traded from Tampa Bay to San Francisco. He really had some promising games in 1987 and 1988, but in 1989, though, Montana, when he was a little banged up in 89, Young stepped in and he played really, really well in that season. But then as for their backfield, we talked about, of course, their running back tandem of Roger Craig and Tom Rathman. Craig was really more of the sturdy running back. He was going to get the necessary rushing yards. Tom Rathman was a really good blocker as a fullback, but he was also a really good receiving fullback as well for the San Francisco 49ers. So those two really helped out big time. We also talked about the dynamic tandem of Jerry Rice and John Taylor, both them FCS products from the 49ers drafting them. Of course, Rice, as I mentioned, from Mississippi Valley State, and John Taylor from Delaware State. So just a really interesting FCS tandem of wide receivers that the 49ers had on their 1989 team. And another really big player that the 49ers had on their 1989 roster on offense was also tight end Brent Jones. As I mentioned before, we saw a little bit of his backstory in the America's Game highlights that I showed you a little while ago, but just a really well-centered offense for George Seifert to really hand off to his offensive coordinator, Mike Holmgren, who really developed that great offense that the 49ers had in 1989 when they were just an offensive juggernaut that season, with Joe Montana being the MVP of the National Football League. But it was much more than just him being the MVP. It was just a phenomenal team effort on offense. And we also talked a little bit about the 49ers offensive line as well. We talked a little bit about Harris Barton. Guy McIntyre was another really big piece of that 89 49ers offensive line. We also had their center, Jesse Sapolu, as well, who was another really important piece of that 49ers offensive line. So really, for Mike Holmgren to really be given the controls to the 49ers offense in 1989, he had a really solid team already there, but still just, the way that he molded Joe Montana into having really his greatest season of his entire 1980 stretch. Of course, a lot of people perhaps think in 1984 when he beat Dan Marino in Super Bowl XIX, a lot of people kind of thought, well, he beat the MVP quarterback, so why wasn't he named MVP of the NFL? Well, in 1989 and 1990, under Mike Holmgren, he won back-to-back MVPs during those 2 years with the San Francisco 49ers. So really big credit, though, to Bill Walsh and all of his management staff, really just developing that great offense that the 49ers were able to have the NFL's #1 ranked offense in that 1989 regular season. And as for the 49ers' key defensive players, this was kind of an interesting unit for the 49ers in 1989. They kind of got some newer pieces on their team later in the season, but really the big two players that were on the San Francisco 49ers defense, you have to include their Hall of Famers and left outside linebacker Charles Haley, as we talked about with his prowess with the San Francisco 49ers before becoming a part of the Dallas Cowboys dynasties of the 1990s. But he was a really big, important piece of that 49ers defense in 1989 and also in 1988 as well, when they won back-to-back Super Bowls. And then you also had safety Ronnie Lott patrolling the backfield of that 49ers secondary unit and really being that big leader of the 49ers defense in 1989 as well, really just developing his skills as a really, talented secondary unit player, even though he kind of really shined as a cornerback early in his career. Once he kind of went into safety, that's really when he showed his versatility in the 49ers secondary. So really those two were really the big contributing pieces of the 49ers defense, and of course both of them being in the Hall of Fame. But there were also a few other really important pieces that we talked about earlier. We talked about Pierce Holt a little bit, the other defensive lineman that was really important for the 49ers in 1989. They also signed linebacker Matt Millen as well when they signed him early in the season as well, really to help that linebacker unit out with Keena Turner and a few others on that 49ers defense as well. So really it was a kind of a mixed effort on defense for the 49ers in 1989. Their defense was still really dominant, but they were a little bit short on the NFL's #1 ranked defense. I think they were only like the 3rd ranked defense in the NFL that season in 1989, but still a top 5 defense in a #1 ranked offense, you're going to have a pretty decent record, and that's what the 49ers did when I mentioned that they went 14-2 in 1989. But right before, though, we get into their statistics as well, there was also one other really key piece, though, of that 49ers 1989 season as well. Early in the 49ers dynasty, in 1981 and 1984, they won with kicker Ray Warshing, who was their primary kicker in 1981 and 1984. But then in 1988, though, during that offseason, though, the San Francisco 49ers, they were able to really get a big steal on a pretty impressive kicker. They signed kicker Mike Kofer, who was a backup kicker actually to Morton Anderson, the great Hall of Famer that he was with the New Orleans Saints, and then later the Atlanta Falcons and a few other teams that he played for. But with Morton Anderson in 1987, he was really the Saints' primary kicker. But when the NFL strike was occurring, there were opportunities for other people to shine, and Mike Kofer was able to shine just enough for the 49ers to offer him a really interesting signing contract. And in 1989, he really just became a really important threat for that 49ers offense. When their offense either stalled or they really got into Mike Cover's range, he was almost dead accurate for most of that season. And he actually led the NFL in 1989 with 136 points scored that season. So really all around, offense, defense, and special teams, really a very well balanced 49ers team that they had in 1989. So just a really terrific job though by, as I mentioned, with the 49ers management and front office really finding these key players and really just developing them into just a phenomenal super team in 1989 when they demolished the NFL competition in the season that capped off their dynasty years of the 1980s. So now what we're going to do, though, is we're going to take a look at some of the key offensive statistics here for the San Francisco 49ers here. So as I mentioned, though, the 49ers, they had the NFL's #1 ranked offense in 1989. They were second overall in passing, and they were 10th overall in the rushing department that season in 1989. So just a really good balance of that 49ers offense. Even though they were more known for their passing attack, Roger Craig and Tom Rathman, even though they were only the 10th ranked rushing team, those two really helped out in a big way for the 49ers in that season for them in 1989. Also for their offense as well, though, they were just a offensive machine as well and really driving the ball down the field as well. They averaged 6.1 yards per play that year in 1989 and converted 350 first downs that season in 1989. Both of them led in the NFL in both of those categories as well. And another really impressive statistic as well here for the 49ers offense as well in 1989. When I talked about Joe Montana with his MVP season, and then you had Steve Young, who really stepped up in a few games when Joe Montana was still kind of just battling with injuries, as he kind of was a little bit later in his career. But both Joe Montana and Steve Young, though, that season, they combined for a 114.8 passer rating that season in 1989, and combined between the two of them, they completed 70.2% of their passes during the regular season as well. We always talk about Drew Brees nowadays, with him kind of throwing almost 68 to 70% accuracy a clip per year in his career. But with Joe Montana and Steve Young in 1989, those two just took their careers to a whole different level. Even though Joe Montana was still going to be the 49ers quarterback for a few more years, they knew that they had a really good predecessor when they knew Joe Montana was eventually going to either retire, or in the case of what did happen when he got hurt, and then Steve Young came in, and then Montana was dealt away to Kansas City in 1993. But the 49ers got a real taste of what they had coming with Steve Young during the 1990s, based on that 1989 season when both of them took their careers to a whole different level in that season in 1989. But perhaps though the one weakness though that 49ers 1989 season was the number of sacks though that Joe Montana and Steve Young took that season. Their offensive line allowed 45 sacks that season, and that was 19th actually in the National Football League that season in 1989. But I kind of give a little bit more of that to Joe Montana a little bit, because he did have one game against the Philadelphia Eagles early in the season when he got battered in that game. I believe he was sacked 8 times in that game, but he battled back in a really historic come-from-behind victory for his career. But that offensive line, though, kind of the one weakness of that 49ers offense in 1989. '89, and also with their rushing department as well. Roger Craig and Tom Rathman, they averaged 4 yards per carry in 1989, and that was 9th ranked in the National Football League that season. And of course, we talked about them being the #1 ranked offense in 1989. They averaged 27.6 points per game is what the San Francisco 49ers accomplished in 1989 for that season. And then also they did a really good job in the turnover department as well for their offense, really being very stingy in that department. They only had 25 turnovers that season in 1989 for the 49ers, 11 interceptions and only 14 lost fumbles for the 49ers that season as well. And that was also in the top 5 ranked in the National Football League as well for San Francisco offensively in 1989. So just a really terrific job, though, by Mike Holmgren and company, really developing that 49ers offense really, really well that season in 1989, and really allowing their defense to not really stop their opponents like on every possession, but still their defense was really dominant as well, as we're going to get to that actually right now here with the San Francisco 49ers defense in 1989. They allowed 15.8 points per game that season in 89, and that was the 3rd least in the National Football League that season in 1989, and they allowed an average of 4.7 yards per play to opposing teams, and that was 5th best in the National Football League as well for the 49ers defense. So a really solid job there. And then for their defense overall, their passing defense, it was 11th ranked in the National Football League that season in 1989. They allowed only 15 passing touchdowns that season, but their rushing defense, this is when they really got the job done. They were the 3rd best rushing defense in the National Football League in 1989. They allowed only 9 rushing touchdowns that season in 89 as well. So really terrific effort by George Seifert and Ray Rhodes and some of the other really big defensive coaches that the 49ers had, really developing that 49ers defense really, really well in 1989 with some of the really key additions, as I talked about with Matt Millen and a few others, as we're going to get to when we look at some of their highlights of their 89 season. Also for the 49ers as well, though, they had 37 takeaways in 1989 as well. That was the 11th in the National Football League as well for the 49ers. They had 21 interceptions and 16 fumble recoveries that season in 89, and their defense also did a really good job limiting their opponents to drive the ball down the field. They allowed only 283 first downs in 89. That was 9th least in the National Football League in that category. And then also for opposing quarterback rating, we talked about with Joe Montana and Steve Young combining for a 114 plus passer rating for the 49ers offense. For their defense, they allowed only a 68.5 passer rating on the other side of the coin for the 49ers defense, and that was 8th in the National Football League as well for the 49ers in 1989. So really just phenomenal effort by some of those really big players for the 49ers defense, really limiting those quarterbacks to go deep those years in 1989, but the NFL starting to become a little bit more pass-heavy during that decade. San Francisco, really incredible job defensively in 89, but perhaps the best part of the 49ers defense as well in 1989, and this is a testament to George Seifert being the really defensive genius that he was, as Bill Walsh was the genius on offense. His defense in 1989, they had the fewest penalties in the National Football League that season. In 1989, only 75 penalties in a 16-game season for the San Francisco 49ers. That's about a 4.5 penalty average a game for George Seifert and that defense. So just a terrific job by Seifert in that department, really disciplining that defense for the San Francisco 49ers that season in '89. And we talked about with Pierce, Holt, and Charles Haley being big in the sack department for the 49ers in the later years of the 80s. The 49ers had 43 sacks that season in 1989. That was 8th in the National Football League as well. And as I mentioned, with the 49ers' third-ranked rushing defense as well, they allowed the fewest rushing attempts in the NFL in 1989. They allowed 372 rushing attempts and allowed only 3.7 yards per carry in '89 as well, and that was 5th ranked in the National Football League that season.
The San Francisco 49ers entered the 1989 season coming off one of the most dramatic wins in Super Bowl history.
39 seconds remaining. Back to throw Montana. Steps up, throws. And the 49ers have won the Super Bowl.
Following their last-second victory in Super Bowl XXIII, many players lingered on the field to savor the moment. But for one 49er, the close shave on the field would be quickly followed by one in the locker room.
I ran off the field, put the shaving cream on, and started shaving right after the game.
I said I wasn't going to shave it until the season was over. I guess the season's over now, so I can shave it.
I didn't even bring it up, wasn't even celebrating. I was in there shaving. That was one of my traits as a football player, was to wear that facial hair and the eye black. I was really trying to scare people, that tough guy mentality, attitude, and I wanted to be perceived that way, not only through my play, but my looks.
In the aftermath of victory, the look of the 49ers was about to change forever.
Was this the final game on the sideline for a great coach, Bill Walsh?
Bill has stepped down as head coach. George Seifert is our new head coach.
George Seifert was Bill Walsh's defensive coordinator the previous 6 years. But his selection to succeed Walsh as head coach was by no means a sure thing.
I was in the process of interviewing with a couple of other NFL teams. In fact, I was en route to Cleveland for an interview, and I had to stop in Dallas. For some reason, I called home, and my wife said to get back on a plane and fly back to San Francisco because they were going to hire me as the head coach. I feel fortunate. You know, I've inherited something that's to be cherished and taken care of. We've had a successful formula, and I've been a part of that. I basically grew up as a professional coach within the organization, whether people thought it was Bill's team. None of that made any difference to me. I realized that we had a winning system. The job was to keep it going and to live up to the standard that had been established when Bill was a head coach.
While Seifert focused on keeping the 49ers dominant on the field, his players reveled in the spoils of victory off it. One of the players giving the champs a bad rap was star receiver Jerry Rice.
When you win Super Bowls, you always try to come up with something that's going to separate you from those who have won before you. So we came up with this rap video.
I move so fast, I'll give you a buzz. You be thinking that you're next to me. Thought you was, cuz.
We really didn't have any rappers. We didn't have any talent in the group.
We're unstoppable, remarkable, more famous than Cosby and the Huxtables.
Pretty much, you know, we just embarrass ourselves. I'm going to leave it at that.
But Rice and his teammates weren't the only ones delivering post-Super Bowl scripted one-liners.
And Jerry Rice, I've heard there's a new TV series coming out based on your Super Bowl performance. Miami Rice.
When you go to the White House, you know that you have made it to the big time.
Under the spotlight of Super Bowl XXIII in Miami, Rice had delivered a big-time performance. He caught 11 passes for a Super Bowl record 215 yards and was named the game's MVP.
You know, I cherish this for the rest of my life, and maybe next year I'll get a chance to come back again.
Repeating as champion was the expectation facing Seifert in his first year as head coach. Fortunately, he inherited a veteran team returning 20 of 22 starters and chose to let them take center stage.
He liked to be behind the scenes, let the product speak for itself as opposed to the head coach.
There was an energy that was created by that. Everybody has a part in it.
Do whatever it takes to win. Whatever it takes.
Right from the get-go, they wanted to demonstrate to the world that they were as instrumental as anybody else in winning previous championships. And when you get players on your team feeling that way, you're going to have a good club.
Welcome back, everybody, to 100 Years of the NFL, a historical journey. I hope you really enjoyed watching some of those transition highlights of the San Francisco 49ers from their win over the Cincinnati Bengals in Super Bowl XXIII, and then the hiring of George Seifert after Bill Walsh stepped down following that victory over the Cincinnati Bengals in that Super Bowl. And just, it was a huge process for the 49ers to really move on, but when Eddie DeBartolo Jr., when he made that decision to hire George Seifert, he knew, of course, George Seifert being the defensive coordinator for the 49ers, he knew not a whole lot of offense was going to be changed up. But, of course, when Mike Holmgren took over and put the 49ers offense as the #1 offense in the league in 1989, that resembled a huge step forward and almost a sense of how much better the 49ers were going to be under George Seifert, whether as with Bill Walsh, it was more methodical with the West Coast style of offense. But when Mike Holmgren became the offensive coordinator, the 49ers offense really started to gel a lot better with all the Hall of Fame talent that they had on that roster. And of course, we're going to talk about that when we are going to talk about their schedule in just a minute here. So let's actually go ahead and let's talk about the San Francisco 49ers regular season schedule, and then after that we're going to see a few of their regular season highlights from the America's Game videos that I have shown you so far in our broadcast. So let's go ahead and let's get started here with the 1989 49ers schedule. So in week 1 of the 1989 NFL season, the San Francisco 49ers played against the Indianapolis Colts in that game, and they won the game by the final score of 30-24 in that game. And in this game, Joe Montana passed for 233 yards in this game and threw a passing touchdown in this game as well. And for their running attack in this one, Roger Craig was the workhorse in this game with 131 yards rushing and 2 rushing touchdowns to his status for this week 1 game. And in the receiving department, Jerry Rice and John Taylor got off to a good start in this game, as both of them combined for 10 catches for 212 yards in this game, and Jerry Rice was the recipient of Joe Montana's passing touchdown in this game. And as for the 49ers defense in this game, Tim McKyer on their secondary unit, he had an interception in the 49ers' first win over the season over the Indianapolis Colts in that one. So a good start for the 49ers against the Colts. And then the next week after that, the 49ers played the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and once again another really close game here as the 49ers won this game by the score of 20-16 in this game. And in this one, Montana a little bit shaky in this one. He did pass for 266 yards in this game and did have another passing touchdown, but he did also throw 2 interceptions in this game against Tampa Bay. But as for the rushing attack here for the 49ers, again, another bit of a weak game here for the 49ers running game, as I was saying at the start of our broadcast, because the 49ers running game really wasn't firing on all cylinders, because the 49ers really wanted to have more of an explosive aerial attack during this season, with Mike Holmgren taking over offensive coordinator duties. But in the game against Tampa Bay, Montana and Roger Craig combined only for 57 rushing yards in this game, but Joe Montana had a rushing touchdown in this game against the Buccaneers in this one. And then as far as the 49ers receiving game here, Roger Craig, Jerry Rice, Tom Rathman, John Taylor, and Brent Jones, they combined for 248 receiving yards in this game against Tampa Bay. And Jerry Rice again was the recipient of Montana's only passing touchdown of the game, but the 49ers defense really stepped up big in this game with 2 sacks and 3 turnovers, including 2 interceptions from their Hall of Fame defensive back Ronnie Lott in this game against Tampa Bay. So that put the 49ers at a pretty impressive mark of 2-0 to start the season, even though those 2 victories were really narrow. But the next week after that, though, this was the big game for Joe Montana against the Philadelphia Eagles in this game when they played them in week 3 here, as the 49ers won this game 38-28 in this game. And this happened to be probably one of the best comeback games that Joe Montana had in his career when he played against the Philadelphia Eagles. And the statistics I'm about to give you, showcase how good Joe Montana was during his '89 season and why he deserved to be the MVP in 1989 as well. In this game against Philadelphia, Joe Montana passed for 428 yards in this game, 5 passing touchdowns, but also did throw another interception in this game. But a really explosive game here for the 49ers passing attack in this one. Rushing attack, though, once again kind of held in check, though, in this game, though, as Joe Montana, Roger Craig, and a backup running back they had named Harry Sidney, the 3 of them only combined for 54 yards rushing in this game against the Philadelphia Eagles. But as for the receiving game, though, here, Tom Rathman, Roger Craig, Jerry Rice, John Taylor, Brent Jones, and Harry Sidney. So between the 6 of them, they combined for 426 receiving yards in this game here for the 49ers. And for their touchdown receivers in this game, Tom Rathman had a receiving touchdown, Jerry Rice had 2 receiving touchdowns, John Taylor had a receiving touchdown, and Brent Jones had a receiving touchdown in this game. So Montana kind of dispersed his receivers really well in this game and really led that big comeback that put the 49ers at a 3-0 mark to really solidify a strong start here to their '89 season. But once again, the 49ers defense again had a really impressive game against the Eagles in this one. 3 turnovers, including another interception for Ronnie Lott in this game, and 4 sacks on Randall Cunningham in this game as well for the 49ers defense. So a really impressive start here by the San Francisco 49ers to get to a 3-0 mark. But the next week after that, though, they took a small step back, though, with a really narrow loss here to the Los Angeles Rams in this Week 4 game. They lost to the Rams 13-12 in this game against the LA Rams here. But Joe Montana had a really no turnover game in this game, even though he didn't throw a passing touchdown, but he did throw for 227 yards in this game and also had 29 rushing yards to his credit as well. And the 49ers rushing attack, along with Montana, they started to kind of gel a little bit in this game. Roger Craig, Tom Rathman, and Harry Sidney combined for 133 yards rushing in this game. Defensively, another pretty, receiving game wise in this game for the 49ers. Roger Craig, Tom Rathman, Harry Sidney, Brent Jones, John Taylor, Jerry Rice, and another backup running back they had named Terrence Flagler. They combined for 218 receiving yards in this game between their 7 receivers that Montana found in this Week 4 game against the Rams. But unfortunately, though, as I was about to say earlier, the 49ers defense didn't really step up big in this game. They didn't have any turnovers and they didn't have any sacks in this game. So it kind of did cost them a little bit not to turn the ball over once against this Rams team, but still a very narrow loss. And as I mentioned, the 49ers only lost 2 games in their 1989 season, but knowing how narrow this loss was to the Rams, they could have easily gone 15-1 or 16-0 if you think about it. When we talk about the other game that they lost to later when we talk about their schedule in the second half of the season. But then the next week after that, though, in week 5 against the New Orleans Saints in this game, the 49ers got back on the winning track here. But again, another really tight game in this one, as the 49ers only won this game by the score of 24-20 in this game against the Saints. Montana, though, started to really showcase his MVP status in this game by another non-turnover game here. He passed for 291 yards in this game and 3 passing touchdowns as well here. Once again, though, the 49ers rushing attack, another subpar performance in this game here. Montana and Roger Craig only combined for 81 rushing yards in this game. But again, the 49ers receiving department, Roger Craig, Jerry Rice, John Taylor, Tom Rathman, and Brent Jones, between the 5 of them, 289 receiving yards in this game, and Jerry Rice and John Taylor combined for the 3 receiving touchdowns from Joe Montana in that game against the Saints. And then as for the 49ers defense, stepping up a little bit in this Week 5 game against New Orleans, Charles Haley, the future Hall of Fame linebacker and edge rusher that he became, he had a sack in this game against the New Orleans Saints, and that put the 49ers at a mark of 4-1. But then the very next week after that, though, this kind of really signified almost the beginning of that controversy between Steve Young and Joe Montana. We kind of noticed a little bit in the America's game during their 1988 season when Walsh really couldn't make a decision between Joe Montana and Steve Young. Well, in this case, though, Joe Montana, he started to kind of still struggle with injuries a little bit, but the 49ers, as an offense, they still remained a high-powered attack, and this was a team that just started to gel a little bit more chemistry now that Steve Young felt that he was going to be the starting quarterback. And in their next game against the Dallas Cowboys here in Week 6, it was Steve Young who actually took most of the snaps in this game after Montana got banged up a little bit in that previous game against the New Orleans Saints. But Steve Young led the 49ers, though, to a 31-14 victory over the Dallas Cowboys here in this game in Week 6. Steve Young passed for 174 yards in this game, 2 passing touchdowns, but also did throw an interception in this game. But this was probably a really impressive game, though, again, for the 49ers rushing attack, because with Steve Young's mobility, it kind of allowed that 49ers rushing attack to gel a little bit more with him spreading out the pocket and really getting defenders on their heels. And in this game, Roger Craig and Steve Young combined for 140 rushing yards in this game, and Roger Craig had a rushing touchdown in this win over the 49ers' hated rival, the Dallas Cowboys. In this game, receiving-wise, another strong game here for the 49ers receiving core. Roger Craig, Brent Jones, Jerry Rice, and Tom Rathman, the 4 of them combined for 151 receiving yards in this game, and Brent Jones and Jerry Rice had a receiving touchdown each in this win over Dallas. And the 49ers defense stepping up here again in this one with 2 interceptions, 4 sacks, and 3 turnovers in this game here for the 49ers defense. So a really solid victory there for Steve Young in his first real action of the 1989 season. But it wasn't the only action, though, that he got in that game against the Dallas Cowboys. He saw a little bit more playing time in some of the other games the 49ers had on their schedule. But then the next week after that, though, this was kind of a really breakout coming out party here for the 49ers offense in this game. Not only contributing in such a big way, but they really gave the 49ers fans a lot to cheer about, because in this Week 7 game, they actually played at Stanford Stadium in this game, because during the 1989 season, everybody remembers about that famous earthquake that happened in Game 3 of the World Series in 1989 that was played at Candlestick Park. But at the same time, though, that was also the 49ers' home field, so they had to move that game to Stanford Stadium. But this game at Stanford Stadium proved to be a huge game, not only for the their two quarterbacks, but really as a team in general against the New England Patriots in this game, as the 49ers won this game in Week 7 by the score of 37-20 in this game against the Patriots. And as I mentioned about the two quarterbacks, both Joe Montana and Steve Young saw some playing time here. Both of them combined for 366 passing yards in this game, 4 passing touchdowns, and no turnovers in this game between the two of them. That's a rare case that you see two quarterbacks get substantial playing time in a game, and neither one of them turns the ball over in a regular season game. And then as for the 49ers rushing department in this game, a really solid effort again here. Joe Montana, Steve Young, Roger Craig, and Tom Rathman, they combined for 135 rushing yards in this game, and Roger Craig had another rushing touchdown to add on for his season in this one. And then receiving game-wise, Roger Craig, John Taylor, Jerry Rice, Tom Rathman, the four of them, they combined for 348 receiving yards in this game. And John Taylor and Jerry Rice had a touchdown catch each in this game here for the 49ers offense in this one. And as for the 49ers defense, another solid performance by them. 2 interceptions, and Larry Roberts, another really important piece on that 49ers defensive line. He contributed with a sack in this game that put the 49ers at a mark of 6-1, almost at the halfway point of their season. So a really strong game for that one, with Montana and Young really combining for the both of them in this game. But then the next game after that, though, against the New York Jets, though, Steve Young got another start here in this game as well, with Montana still trying to get back to being the healthy quarterback that he was for most of his career. But in this Week 8 game against the New York Jets, the 49ers won this game by the score of 23-10 in this game to improve Young's record on the season to 2-0 in the games that he started. But in this one, actually, Steve Young got hurt in this one, and his backup quarterback, Steve Bono, actually came in and contributed to the 49ers passing attack in this one. So Steve Young and Steve Bono in this game passed for 244 yards combined between the two of them, 2 passing touchdowns. And for the 49ers rushing game in this one, Steve Young, Roger Craig, Tom Rathman, and Terrence Flagler combined for 159 rushing yards in this game. In the receiving department, another strong game for them here. Roger Craig, Jerry Rice, Brent Jones, and John Taylor, the 4 of them combined for 220 receiving yards in this game. And it was Jerry Rice and Brent Jones who were the recipients of the 2 passing touchdowns from Steve Young and Steve Bono in this game here. And again, the 49ers defense, another strong performance here. 2 turnovers in this game, but 9 sacks, though, against the New York Jets. Even though the Jets didn't really have great years in those later 80s years and early 90s years, they made a mockery of that Jets offensive line in that Week 8 game, as the 49ers improved to 7-1 on the season with that big win against the Jets. And then the next week after that, though, the 49ers actually played against the New Orleans Saints again in their regular season. And this was actually the game, if you remember, the introduction at the very start of our broadcast here, that Monday Night Football introduction. This was actually the game of that Monday Night Football introduction between the 49ers and the Saints here in this Week 9 game. And this was another strong victory here for the 49ers in this Week 9 game, as they beat the New Orleans Saints by the score of 31-13 in this game. And this was finally a healthy game here for Joe Montana to finally get back to his MVP status in this game, as he passed for 302 yards in this game, 4 total touchdowns actually in this game, including 1 rushing touchdown and 3 passing touchdowns for Joe Montana in this game against the Saints defense here. And in this one as well, the Saints kind of again shut down the 49ers rushing attack in this game, kind of for the first time in a number of weeks. Their running game kind of was firing on all cylinders for a little while with Steve Young and Joe Montana kind of switching gears a little bit. But in this game, though, Joe Montana, Roger Craig, and Tom Rathman, they only combined for 89 rushing yards between the three of them. But then, as for the 49ers receiving department in this game, though, Roger Craig, Tom Rathman, Jerry Rice, John Taylor, Brent Jones, and another backup wide receiver they had named Terry Greer. Between the six of them, they combined actually for 22 catches for Montana's 302 passing yards that he passed for in this game. So just a very diverse receiving unit that Montana had in this game to throw to in his first game back after sitting a few games after he got banged up a little bit early in the season. But the 49ers defense, again, sticking to their script as well. 2 interceptions in this game and 3 sacks against the New Orleans Saints in this Week 9 victory for the San Francisco 49ers. The very next week after that, though, in Week 10 against the Atlanta Falcons, the 49ers, once again, a sound beatdown victory here against the Atlanta Falcons. In this one, they crushed them here in this Week 10 game by the final score of 45-3 in this game against the Atlanta Falcons. So just a huge smackdown, beatdown in this game against Atlanta. And in this one, Joe Montana passed for 270 passing yards in this game, 4 touchdowns, including 1 rushing touchdown and 3 passing touchdowns again here for Joe Montana. So he started to kind of really get back healthy a little bit after, as I was telling, he was a little bit banged up and Steve Young had to take over a little bit for him, but he really stepped up for the 49ers during the second half of the season to get his MVP at the end of the 1989 season for Joe Montana. But as for the 49ers rushing attack, though, in this game, this was probably the best game in terms of rushing yards here for the 49ers all season. Joe Montana, Roger Craig, Tom Rathman, Terrence Flagler, and another backup running back they had named Keith Henderson. Between the 5 of them, they combined for 233 rushing yards between them. So a strong, balanced attack here in this game against Atlanta. And then receiving game-wise, Roger Craig, Tom Rathman, Jerry Rice, Brent Jones, John Taylor, and Keith Henderson. Between the 6 of them, 16 catches for Joe Montana's 270 passing yards that he threw for in this game. And the 49ers defense kind of sticking to the same script, 2 sacks and 1 takeaway in this game here for that defense led by their head coach George Seifert. So another strong victory here for the San Francisco 49ers. That put them at a mark of 9-1 after that Week 10 victory against the Falcons. But the very next week, though, after that, though, this was the other loss that the 49ers had during that 1989 season. But as I was saying, about the 49ers earlier, they could have gone 16-0 based on how close these losses were. They lost to the Green Bay Packers by the score of only 21-17 in this game here for the 49ers in this one. So they only lost those 2 games by a total of 5 points between the Rams earlier and the Packers later in the season, as we're talking about here right now in this game. So just incredible how the 49ers went 15-1 in that 1984 season. They could have easily gone 15-1 in 1989 as well. Just an amazing dynasty run that they had in the 1980s. But in this game here, Joe Montana against the Green Bay Packers, he passed for 325 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, but also did throw an interception in this game here against the Packers. Rushing game-wise, another shutdown game here for the 49ers opponents in this one. Joe Montana, Roger Craig, and Tom Rathman, only 71 rushing yards combined between the 3 of them in this loss to the Packers. So a little bit not as balanced as the 49ers were in some of their games that they had earlier in the season. And that kind of seemed to be like that one critique you could say about that 49ers offense. Even though they were the #1 ranked offense that season in 1989. Sometimes when you got that running game going off balance, that kind of led to more of a passing attack. Even though Joe Montana and Steve Young are in the Hall of Fame, sometimes they did have the games where they did have some interceptions and they did turn the ball over. They were human in some of their games that they did play in their legendary Hall of Fame careers for the both of them. But then in the receiving game, though, in this game against Green Bay, though, Tom Rathman, Roger Craig, Jerry Rice, John Taylor, and Brent Jones, between the 5 of them in this game, they combined for 312 receiving yards in this game here, and Roger Craig and Jerry Rice were the recipients of Montana's touchdown passes in this game. And the 49ers defense, another pretty solid game there for them. They had 2 sacks and 1 turnover in this game against the Green Bay Packers. Even though this put the 49ers at a 9-2 mark, I think George Seifert, though, knowing how close those losses were, he said, we can build really strong about this. We know we got a great team here, so let's finish strong. And they finished really strong during their last 5 games of the season here, starting out with their next game here in Week 12 when they played the New York Giants in this game here, and the 49ers won this game by the score of 34-24 in this game, and this turned out to be a really nice revenge game for Joe Montana after throwing an interception the previous week here. Montana really had a phenomenal game here. He passed for 292 yards in this game against the Giants defense and threw 3 passing touchdowns against New York in this one. And as for the 49ers rushing game in this one, a little bit of a better performance in this one. Montana, Tom Rathman, Roger Craig, and Jerry Rice, they combined for 95 rushing yards between the 4 of them in this game. So a little bit of a better game for the 49ers rushing attack here. And Tom Rathman had a rushing touchdown in this game here for the 49ers offense. Receiving game-wise, Roger Craig, Tom Rathman, Jerry Rice, Brent Jones, John Taylor, and another backup wide receiver they had named Mike Wilson. Between the 6 of them, they combined for 27 catches for the 292 yards that Montana threw for in that game. So you just kind of see, just the variety of weapons that the 49ers receiving game had, and just how Joe Montana and Steve Young really dispersed all those passes. They didn't throw all of them to Jerry Rice and John Taylor. They got Brent Jones into the game. They got Roger Craig and Tom Rathman into the games. Just a really diverse receiving unit the 49ers had that season. And then defensively wise, this was probably their strongest game of the season for the 49ers defense. They rampaged Phil Simms and that Giants offense in this game. They committed 5 turnovers against the Giants in this one, including 3 interceptions for the 49ers secondary unit and 7 sacks in this game against the New York Giants. So probably their strongest defensive game of the season against the Giants in that Week 12 game that put them at a mark of 10-2, entering their next game in Week 13 against the Atlanta Falcons. Again in this one, and this wasn't as big of a blowout as the game that they had earlier against the Atlanta Falcons. The 49ers only won this game by the score of 23-10 in this game, and this was another strange game again for the 49ers passing attack. Montana committed an interception in this game, and Steve Young actually came in almost for one of the last times during the season for Steve Young in this game. So as I was mentioning, Montana had an interception in this game, but Steve Young came in this game, and he had 2 touchdowns in this game, including 1 rushing touchdown and 1 passing touchdown, but both of them combined for 320 passing yards in this game against the Atlanta Falcons. Rushing game-wise, really strong with only 2 running backs in this game. Roger Craig and Tom Rathman, just the 2 of them. The 49ers solid pair in the backfield. They combined for 116 rushing yards in this game here against the Falcons. And receiving game-wise, Roger Craig, Tom Rathman, John Taylor, Jerry Rice, and Brent Jones. Between the 5 of them, they combined for 301 receiving yards in this game. And again, the 49ers defense under George Seifert doing their job. 2 interceptions and 2 sacks in this Week 13 game against the Atlanta Falcons. So Montana, a little bit of a shaky game in that rematch against the Atlanta Falcons, but Steve Young coming in and working his magic to get the 49ers back on a solid winning track. But they still had a little bit of business to take care of, and the 49ers got their revenge the very next week against Los Angeles Rams in Week 14 in another really tight victory against a 49ers opponent in this game, as they beat the Los Angeles Rams by the score of 30-27 in this game. But Joe Montana really came out strong in this game, even though he did throw 2 interceptions, but he did pass for 458 passing yards in this game and 3 passing touchdowns. So a pretty strong performance by Joe Montana in this game. But again, another weak performance by the 49ers rushing game in this one, as Roger Craig and Joe Montana only combined for 60 rushing yards in this game, but Roger Craig did have another rushing touchdown to add to his season for the 49ers offense. And then defensively, receiving game wise, Roger Craig, Tom Rathman, John Taylor, Brent Jones, and Jerry Rice, they combined for 451 receiving yards between the 5 of them in this game. And John Taylor actually had 2 of Montana's 3 passing touchdowns that he threw for in that Week 14 win against the Rams. And then defensively, another really solid performance here. 2 takeaways, and Pierce Holt, that other really big piece of that 49ers defensive line that I talked about, he had a sack in this game on the Rams quarterback Jim Everett in this game, and that split the season series for the 49ers and the Rams with that victory for San Francisco that put them at a 12-2 mark. And then the very next week after that, the 49ers played the Buffalo Bills in this game, and Steve Young actually got most of the game actually in this game against the Buffalo Bills. This was probably his shakiest game of the season, though, against the Bills in Week 15. Young only passed for 166 yards in this game, 2 passing touchdowns, but also did throw 2 interceptions in this game. But he also had a rushing touchdown in this game as well for the 49ers offense. But again, the 49ers rushing attack really coming alive under Steve Young whenever he started for the 49ers during their '89 season. Roger Craig, Terrence Flagler, Tom Rathman, and Keith Henderson, they combined for 151 rushing yards between the 4 of them, and Roger Craig had another rushing touchdown in this game. And then receiving game wise here, Roger Craig, Tom Rathman, Keith Henderson, Jerry Rice, and John Taylor, they only had 9 catches actually between the 5 of them in this game, but Jerry Rice had a receiving touchdown in this game here for the 49ers offense in this game. But just a little bit of a weird offensive game for the 49ers, even though their rushing game was really strong against the Bills defense in this one, but a bit of a shaky performance in this game against Buffalo. But the 49ers defense, again, just stepping up and really handling their business. Even though they weren't the number 1 ranked defense, they were still a top 5 defense that season under head coach George Seifert. They had 5 takeaways in this game, including 3 interceptions off of Jim Kelly in this game. And Kevin Fagan, another big piece of that 49ers defense, he contributed with 2 sacks in this game here for the 49ers defense as well. So just again, just a really solid team performance. Even though their quarterback situation kind of seemed a little bit shaky in some games, 49ers just really good job under Mike Holmgren and George Seifert and all of his coaches, just doing a tremendous job just keeping this team on even footing. Even though that quarterback controversy was still going between Steve Young and Joe Montana, they still did a phenomenal job really just keeping their eyes on the prize and still getting a solid regular season going 14-2, and they capped off their 14th win of the season the very next week against the Chicago Bears when they shut them out 26-0 in their season finale against Chicago. And in this game, Montana and Steve Young split the workload again in this game, as Montana passed for 1 touchdown in this game, but also did throw another interception. But Steve Young also contributed in this game for the both of them with 206 passing yards combined between the two of them. And rushing game wise, again, another 100-yard game with a combination of runners in this game. Joe Montana, Steve Young, Terrence Flagler, Roger Craig, and Tom Rathman. Between the 5 of them, 121 rushing yards between them in this game. And Terrence Flagler actually had his first rushing touchdown of the season in this game against the Chicago Bears. And then receiving game-wise, Terrence Flagler came through, Roger Craig, Tom Rathman, Keith Henderson, Jerry Rice, Brent Jones, and they had a backup tight end named Jamie Williams, who also got involved in this game as well for the 49ers. Between the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them, they combined for 16 catches in this game for the 206 passing yards that Steve Young and Joe Montana threw for in this game. And again, the 49ers defense sticking to the same schedule as they had all season. Another strong performance. 5 takeaways in this game, including 3 interceptions, and Charles Haley, their Hall of Fame defensive edge rusher, had a sack in this game as well to put the 49ers at a 14-2 mark and the #1 seed in the NFC playoffs come January in that 1989 season for the San Francisco 49ers. So just an incredible season here for George Seifert in his first full year taking over Bill Walsh. And, you know, I could understand probably the pressure that he felt, really knowing if he didn't know how good this 49ers team was going to be. But when Mike Holmgren came in with his offensive attack and George Seifert just focused on the defense, 49ers never really looked back after this 1989 season. They still just said, you know what, we've got 2 Hall of Fame quarterbacks going at it here. We still have a high-octane offense and a great defense to fall back on. It almost was the perfect scenario for George Seifert to go into for a first-year head coach. And Seifert did a tremendous job really keeping that 49ers team together, even after Bill Walsh, the legend that he is and the Hall of Fame coach that Bill Walsh is, stepped down following the 1988 season. But George Seifert and the job that he did after that 1989 season, before I believe he got fired at the end of the 1996 season, I think it's a strong case that George Seifert deserved to be in the Hall of Fame as well for how much he did to help that 49ers team really reach another level after Bill Walsh left the 49ers following the 1988 season.
To this day, you know, contrary to what many think, you know, I feel like I was the right guy for the job because I was aware of the system, having coached there for 9 years, but also aware of the history of the 49ers, having lived it, you know, being a fan of the team.
George Seifert grew up in San Francisco's Mission District. He played prep football at Polytechnic High, just across the street from Kezar Stadium. On Sundays, members of the football team were ushers at 49er games.
Each of the home football games, we were assigned certain sections, and you know, I think we watched more than we really worked.
10 seconds left. Lions lead it.
I remember watching the first alley-oop pass to R.C. Owens.
This has got to be the alley-oop. There's no time for anything else.
I remember when I first went to work for the 49ers, I said, my gosh, I'm working next to R.C. Owens. I mean, that was a pretty big deal. It was nice to get a paycheck too, but you know, I don't want to tell anybody, but I just, to be there, I would have done it for nothing.
In 1989, Seifert wasn't just working with 49er greats. He had the unenviable task of replacing one.
Bill Walsh, he was the legend. And George had to win the team over. And he's totally different from Bill Walsh.
He was a little bit more dry sense of humor. Nowhere near, you know, the prankster that Bill Walsh was.
You've got to have everybody 100% fresh for this ballgame. Somehow you've got to be fresh. In some cases it may mean a lot of sex, in others none. I don't know.
Bill Walsh was known for his humor. But with Seifert, it was his quirky body language and many superstitions, such as always following the same path
out to the practice field and never stepping on the team's logo.
Sort of like a little entertainment for us when he was coming out on the field. It was hilarious because we would watch him. He would never walk on that logo.
They probably noticed that one more than any other. I'd always walk around it. It was a sign of respect. I wasn't going to walk on our logo. It was like I wouldn't walk on the American flag. I feel like I'm in, The Sopranos right now. I'm talking to my my psychiatrist here. George, why do you, is it because your mother wasn't good to you or something, you know? When you're in that situation and there's a certain amount of stress, you have these little things out there that you turn to. One of my superstitions was to blow on a breath mint 3 times.
Blow through the middle of them. For what reason, I don't know.
If I didn't do that, we wouldn't win the ball game. I kept waiting for Search to give me a commercial or something, you know, it didn't work.
Heading into the '89 season opener, he was an unknown after spending most of his career in the coach's booth.
I'm a little anxious about it, in that I have spent so many years upstairs and you can hide out a little bit up there, whereas now, you know, be in the public eye more, and it'll take some getting used to.
In week 1 at Indianapolis, Seifert donned the coach's headset for the first time.
It was like a pilot getting into a fighter plane before you went to battle. When you're on the sideline, you have quite a bit more going on around you. I mean, the tension is indescribable.
George Seifert on the sideline. That's a new position for him. He has spent the last 15 years in the booth. Now all of a sudden he's down on the field. So he's not quite sure how to act down there on the field either.
But the 49er players had been here many times before.
40, he's to the 30. Taylor gives him a block. He's down to the 10. He's into the end zone. Touchdown 49ers.
Joe Montana's 58-yard completion to Jerry Rice helped give Seifert his first win. The only thing Montana failed to give his new coach in '89 was a nickname.
George, we didn't have a name for him.
The rest of the team was not so fortunate.
Joe Montana's a guy that names everybody. Throughout my career, everybody noted me as Woody.
One Woody caught.
Joe thought I looked like the character on Cheers, the bartender, Woody Harrelson, and that kind of stuck.
Worse than Woody was the name Montana tried to pin on Jerry Rice.
They called him Fifi one year. If you go back to '87, you look at his haircut, he looked like a poodle. I swear to God, Fifi.
I had this hairstyle that was very unique, and they started calling me Fifi. I was a little pissed off about it at first, but then I was like, okay, just let these guys, you know, have their fun, because whenever you get defensive, they feel like they got you. You have to just play along with it, and hopefully it dies out, and it did.
One nickname that survives to this day is the one the players gave to Montana.
Bird legs.
Bird legs. He had no legs, no calves or anything, so we always gave him a hard time.
Well, he's got funny legs for a quarterback, doesn't he?
The last time I saw legs like that, they were hanging out of a nest.
34 years to get this development.
But I'll tell you what, those bird legs got him out of a lot of trouble.
Just 45 seconds to play in the game. Niners still trail by 3. On his hip, Montana to the end zone. Touchdown 49ers. He brings it in himself.
In week 2 at Tampa Bay, Montana's bird legs skittered home with a game-winning touchdown. But the following week at Philadelphia, they could not escape the Eagles' talons. For the first 3 quarters, Philly's defense battered Montana and took a 21-10 lead into the final 15 minutes.
He got sacked 8 times, and he kept battling back.
When you get sacked 8 times, you can easily point the finger.
Eagles have been getting the Montana.
When you're knocking him around, Joe is never going to point any fingers. He just hung in there. He's like the comeback kid. He's Joe Cool.
It's up the right sideline, and breaking loose and going to go all the way. Taylor will go.
John Taylor's 70-yard catch and run triggered a fourth-quarter scoring frenzy.
He's got Rathman. He's into the end zone. Touchdown. Montana to throw. Goes downfield. He's got Jones. Touchdown 49ers.
The 49ers take the lead.
Montana would cap the comeback by hitting Jerry Rice for his 4th touchdown pass of the quarter.
End zone. Rice has got it. Touchdown 49ers.
Joe had done that so many times. He had the uncanny ability to be so cool under pressure, as everybody's talked about for years. He was a surgeon in pressure situations.
Jim, you're all right. Jeff?
You know, be able to come back in Philly. Those were the defining moments, in my opinion, of that '89 season.
After 3 straight wins on the road, the 49ers appeared headed toward another victory in their home opener. Nursing a late 2-point lead, they called on Tom Rathman to run out the clock.
We were up 12-10, and I think there was, 3 minutes left in the game. We're driving down. We're getting near their red zone. Well, we run a little counter.
Montana gives to Rathman into the middle.
Got hit, fumbled the football.
It marked the first time Rathman had lost a fumble in over 3 years with the team.
Rathman lost it.
They recovered it on the 20-yard line, drove down, kicked a field goal.
5 seconds showing on the clock.
Ended up beating us 13-12.
Kick is up, and it is good.
I'll never forget it. Call that Black Sunday in my house.
Rathman's disdain for fumbling dated back to his first training camp in 1986, when Bill Walsh ripped him in front of the other rookies.
I remember back in Rockland fumbling the football a little bit coming in as a rookie, and Walsh coming up to me and saying, "Hey, this isn't college, you're not on scholarship, we don't have to keep you." And everybody's rear ends just went.
You're going to condition yourself to playing football without fumbling it. You're not going to take a chance on losing that damn ball. Second, you find yourself relaxing and you'll be out of the league.
Rathman soon developed the surest hands on the team as both a runner and receiver. It became Walsh's most versatile weapon.
Tacklers again.
His power running style put some toughness in Walsh's West Coast offense, as did his ferocious blocking.
You don't want to be known as a finesse football team. I'm blue collar myself. The way I like to hit guys was square them up, take them right down here. That's the first thing that makes contact right there, your forehead. That's what it's all about, taking them right down the middle and getting that pinched nerve where, ah! That's what it's all about right there.
In Week 5, following the loss to the Rams, Rathman took out his frustrations on the Saints. Joe Montana threw 3 second-half touchdown passes to rally the 49ers from a 17-3 deficit and shock the Saints.
49ers!
But a bigger shock awaited them at home.
We have reports of major power outages in San Francisco and reports throughout the Bay Area. The reason, if you do not know by now, was a major earthquake. We do not have a Richter scale reading on that yet.
I think it was October 17th. I actually was walking through Candlestick's parking lot, going to Game 3 of the World Series. Well, all of a sudden, I'm talking the ground moves 6 inches one way, 6 inches the other way.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are postponing the game because there's no power in the stadium.
I mean, it was chaos.
I was on my way to dinner. I was taking my family out. We were in the car, and the car just started shaking, and I'm thinking, okay, I have a flat tire. So I pulled over to the side, and that's when I noticed something had just happened.
Where my office was upstairs, there was a bathroom and shower. And I had just gotten out of the shower, facing the mirror with a towel around me, and all of a sudden the whole building started going. Being a native San Franciscan, I realized what we were going through, so I made a beeline for the door that went out to the deck outside of my office, and I was just about ready to jump over the side. The towel in my body, that was it. And then I felt it kind of subside a little bit.
Prepare yourselves! Store water in your bathtub!
What we went through was minuscule compared to what certain areas did.
5 days after the earthquake, the 49ers played their next game at Stanford Stadium because of structural damage to Candlestick Park. Steve Young relieved an injured Joe Montana and led the 49ers to an emotional victory.
Rice has got it! It's going to go all the way!
We wanted to go back out there and try to take some of that pain away. If we could just bring a smile just for a couple hours, you know, we felt like we did our job.
Tom Rathman enjoyed the best pass-catching day of his career.
Me in particular, I loved the place. I caught 11 balls for like 103 yards and, got the game ball, and we ended up winning the game. I was the game captain that week, so it was a special day for myself.
It was also a special day for Young, who threw 3 touchdown passes and stirred a quarterback controversy after the game.
Obviously, Joe's been spectacular, and I realize that. I feel like if I could play every week for a while, that, I could start doing the same kind of a thing.
Steve was, frothing at the mouth to become the player for the 49ers. I do recall it seemed like after each practice, Mike Holmgren walking off the practice field and Steve walking behind him, talking to him in his animated fashion, how many, I want more reps. How many more years do I have to do this? And at the same time, Joe was the man.
For a coach, it's a nice situation to be in, really.
How do you keep them happy?
Well, I don't think I keep them happy. Neither one gets the number of repetitions they want.
In Week 8, Young would again start for the ailing Montana, only to be injured himself.
Didn't matter if Joe Montana was in a game. Didn't matter if Steve Young was the guy. It didn't matter if Steve Bono was the guy. Whoever was a quarterback was expected to get the job done.
Play fake to Rodgers.
Third-string quarterback Steve Bono came off the bench to throw a key touchdown pass.
We had tremendous talent. I'm talking about across the board. I don't know if there was one weak spot on our team. That's the type of depth that we had.
Boy, the depth on this football team is just indescribable.
For you.
From his earliest days with the team, George Seifert enjoyed a special bond with his defensive players, especially at Christmas when they presented him with an annual gag gift. Safety Ronnie Lott was particularly sorry to have to share his mentor with the offense in 1989.
Seifert becomes the head coach, you lose your defensive coordinator. Does this mean he forgets about you?
Of course he has already. He won't let us hit the receivers. Now he's telling us what Bill used to tell us: stay away from him, don't touch him. It's a little demeaning to see a guy like that change so fast, I'm a little upset that he's really taking that attitude.
We're the players on the team. We're the ones responsible. You can't just always say the coach has got to make me do this or make me do that. This was an attitude that Ronnie Lott demonstrated probably more than anybody.
We all got to stick together in this.
There was something special about him that his spirit kind of permeated through the rest of the club.
Oh, my goodness.
With Lott leading the charge.
Oh, my, Ronnie Lott.
Seifert's defense was dominant.
Pressure by Haley, and the ball slips out of his hands.
2 late personnel moves helped. In Week 2, the 49ers signed Matt Millen, who was cut by the Raiders in training camp. Though he once bled silver and black, Millen would pump new life into the 49ers defense.
Heck, I would never have thought I'd have played for this team. But then I never thought of playing with any other team other than the Raiders, so surprise, surprise.
We've seen this time and again where a player might be at the end of his line with a certain club, he goes to the next club and he has a great year. Well, that's what happened with Matt. Matt played really well for us.
Matt Millen brought a little of that old Raider mentality to the 49ers, added his own type of sizzle.
There was a change from the environment he was used to as a player. I think he really enjoyed our environment. He thrived on it.
Millen says he feels like he's gone into the land of Oz since he came to the 49ers.
Millen wasn't the only waiver wire pickup to find new life by the Bay. In Week 11, the 49ers signed nose tackle Jim Burt, a career New York Giant who almost ended Joe Montana's career 3 seasons earlier.
He was the guy that had knocked Joe for a loop a couple of years before that.
And Montana's hurt.
He was kind of one of the bad guys, and now he was on our team.
I'm just kind of like in a twilight zone being here and being on their team.
He had a lot of fun with it, and he and Joe would hit it off.
That do it, guys? You gotta do it when I'm not looking, Joe. You telegraphed it, babe. But
Millen and Burt made their presence felt in a Monday night game against Burt's former team, the New York Giants. Early in the game, Burt exacted a measure of revenge on his former team.
Stripped by Burt. It's a live ball. San Francisco has it.
Millen played his best game of the season.
Matt Millen comes charging through, makes the tackle. He's a pleasant addition to this 49ers squad.
The New York Giants, that was a team that everybody disliked. You know, they played slobber knock football. I think West Coast was thought of more finesse, soft. We felt like we were tougher than that. And the only way to prove that was knocking guys in the mouth ourselves.
It was an emotional ball game. When there's two teams that have been champions here in the last few years, it was a hell of an emotional battle.
If the defense was Seifert baby, the offense was Mike Holmgren's foster child.
George was a defensive coach, so he let the coordinator, Mike Holmgren, that first year, do his thing.
The ball's here. Now from here, right up.
Certainly that 89 season, Mike Holmgren did an outstanding job, too. I mean, we were #1 in the league as far as scoring points. We were the #1 offense.
Joe Montana was groomed by Bill Walsh, but it was with Holmgren calling the plays in '89 that he had his finest season ever, setting an NFL single-season record with a quarterback rating of 112.4.
He's got a great accuracy and great touch. And boy, did he rip a beauty, a perfect pass to Jerry Rice. His experience and his knowledge of our offense and where people are on defense, you just couple all that together, and then that little extra special something that no one seems to be able to define, and you got perhaps the greatest quarterback that's ever played.
In 1989, Jerry Rice was on his way to becoming the greatest receiver of all time. He led the NFL in receiving yards and touchdowns. He teamed with John Taylor to form the NFL's best receiving combo. Together, Rice and Taylor accounted for 27 touchdowns and over 2,500 yards, much of it coming after the catch.
Because of Jerry, John might not have received some of the same publicity, certainly, but was just a phenomenal athlete. Maybe one of the strongest players I'd ever been around, pound for pound.
In 1989, Rice and Taylor were particularly lethal on a pattern called quick slant.
I think the secret to the quick slant is that the quarterback, the way he delivers the ball has to be there.
Montana drills a pass, slant into Rice.
Also, you have to catch it at top speed.
He's to the 5, touchdown 49ers!
John and I, we were, really good at working the defensive back on the outside, and once you broke inside, Joe would put the ball there. And
slanted to Taylor, he beats the first wall.
Then it's up to you just to become a football player. It's just like almost sandlot football.
He's to the 5, ball is in the end zone, touchdown 49ers!
I would prefer to catch a 5-yard slant and go 95 yards any day. Because it's exciting, because it's almost like the hair is like standing up on your back, because everybody's chasing you and they're trying to catch you.
He's got Rice, he breaks loose to the 30. He's going to be gone. I don't think they can catch him.
If you're able to cross that goal line without getting caught, it's a great feeling.
Play that seems to work every time they do it.
John Taylor would take the quick slant to a new level in a Week 14 Monday night showdown at the Rams. The 49ers found themselves trailing 17-3.
I remember their owner, Georgia, at the end of the first half, for walking along the sidelines down on the field with a glass of wine, kind of holding it up to the crowd, toasting the crowd. I mean, this was their game to win.
Montana to throw. He's got a man all alone. It's Taylor. He's in a foot race. He's down the sidelines to midfield. Makes a cut. Goes to the 40. He's got a blocker in front of him to the 30. He's to the 20. Cuts it again. Still has a defender. Goes into the end zone. 92-yard touchdown pass.
It was exciting to see. He was able to do that twice on a Monday night, and I think it just showed that he could have went anywhere else and he would have been the focus.
Joe, a slant into Taylor. Taylor breaks a tackle, cuts across the middle, breaks another to the 30.
If you look at them, there were guys rallying down the football field, and that's what we prided ourselves on. If we didn't have the football, we were getting ourselves in a position to make a block to allow the guy to go the distance.
John Taylor, another spectacular touchdown of 95 yards.
Both those plays were just 5-yard slant passes.
So the Niners go unbeaten on the road
this season. They have clinched the NFC West.
When the game was over, I had my headset on, and I was in such a daze as to what had gone on. I started just running off the field. I still had my headset on.
Seifert was so excited he was trying to walk off the field with that headset. I mean, that would have to be a long cord.
They were laughing and grabbing me and trying to get the headset because I was just oblivious. If they could have stuck knives in me, I probably wouldn't have felt it.
So the road to the Super Bowl will have to go through San Francisco.
Welcome back, everybody, to 100 Years of the NFL, a historical journey. I hope you really enjoyed watching some of the regular season highlights of the 1989 49ers and just an amazing season by George Seifert, Mike Holmgren, and all really the key players on the San Francisco 49ers that we talked about. And, of course, introducing three other members that were huge to their success as well. You saw Jerry Rice, of course, talk about their season, Tom Rathman and George Seifert giving their takes on how great that season was for the San Francisco 49ers, going 14-2 and getting a number one seed in the NFC playoffs, entering January for them to make a run to their second straight Super Bowl, in which they did. And what we're going to go ahead and do right now is we're going to go ahead and talk about the 49ers postseason schedule, and then we're going to talk about their final statistics for some of their individual players, and then after that we'll see their postseason highlights, and then I'll unveil to you our next team that we will be covering here on our 100 Years of the NFL, a historical journey. So let's go ahead and let's talk about this postseason schedule for the 1989 49ers. So after finishing the regular season 14-2, the San Francisco 49ers' first playoff game in the NFC divisional round, they played against the Minnesota Vikings in this game, and they won this game really convincingly. 41-13 was the final score in this game against Minnesota. And in this game, Joe Montana, just another solid performance for his MVP season that he had in 1989. He passed for 241 yards in that game. He threw 4 passing touchdowns and no interceptions. So a really strong performance by Montana. Rushing game-wise, Roger Craig, Tom Rathman, and Terrence Flagler, between the three of them, they rushed for 175 yards between the three of them. And Roger Craig had another rushing touchdown to add on for his season here. And then as for the receiving game here, you had Tom Rathman, Jerry Rice, John Taylor, Brent Jones, and Keith Henderson. So between the 5 of them, they combined for 17 catches for Montana's 241 passing yards that he threw for in this game against Minnesota. And the San Francisco 49ers defense really stepped up in the postseason as well. In their first game, they had 5 takeaways against the Minnesota Vikings, including 4 interceptions, and had 4 sacks in that NFC divisional opener. So a really strong start to the postseason for the San Francisco 49ers. And their next game actually was another rematch against the Los Angeles Rams, as I was telling you, when they split the regular season series between these two teams. But it was the Rams that had to head back to San Francisco for the NFC Championship game after they beat the 49ers in that really close game early in the season when they beat them 13-12. But this time the 49ers crushed the Rams in the NFC Championship game by the score of 30-3 in this game against Los Angeles. Montana, another great game for him in this one. He passed for 262 yards in this game, 2 passing touchdowns, and no turnovers once again for the league MVP. For the running game here for the 49ers in this one, Roger Craig, Tom Rathman, and Terrence Flagler, they rushed for 175 yards in this game against the Rams in this one. And Roger Craig had another rushing touchdown, so he had 2 rushing touchdowns in his first 2 playoff games. And I just wanted to correct something on the Vikings game. Actually, the 49ers between Rathman, Terrence Flagler, and Roger Craig in that divisional round game, they rushed for 162 yards. And in the NFC Championship game, they rushed for 175 yards. I just want to correct that for the 49ers fans who are watching this here on my YouTube channel here. But as for the 49ers receiving game, though, in the NFC Championship game here, Roger Craig, Tom Rathman, John Taylor, Brent Jones, Jerry Rice, and they also had another backup wide receiver named Mike Sherrard, who also contributed in this game for the 49ers. Between the six of them, they combined for 255 receiving yards in this game for the 49ers receiving core. And defensively, again, really strong performance against Jim Everett. 3 interceptions and a Larry Roberts sack in this game for the 49ers defense as well. Put them in the Super Bowl 24 in 2 weeks after they really demolished their first 2 playoff opponents, and it really put them in their second straight Super Bowl and their 4th in 8 years for the 49ers, and just an incredible job by Bill Walsh and George Seifert. And they capped off their dynasty with another crushing, demolishing performance in Super Bowl 24 against John Elway's Denver Broncos. And this game just wasn't even close, as the 49ers beat the Denver Broncos in Super Bowl 24 by the score of 55-10 in this game, and just another just thumping victory for the San Francisco 49ers. And Joe Montana, as he did all season for his league MVP, he won Super Bowl MVP with a masterful performance against that Broncos defense. He passed for 297 yards and 5 passing touchdowns in that game in Super Bowl 24. Rushing game-wise, another strong performance in this game. Joe Montana, Roger Craig, Tom Rathman, and Terrence Flagler, between the 4 of them, they rushed for 136 yards in this game. And Roger Craig and Tom Rathman combined for 3 rushing touchdowns in Super Bowl 24. And then receiving game-wise, another strong performance here. Roger Craig, Jerry Rice, John Taylor, and Tom Rathman, between the 4 of them, 274 receiving yards. And it was Jerry Rice and John Taylor that were responsible for 4 receiving touchdowns in this game for the 49ers receiving core. And then 49ers defense really bugged John Elway a lot during the game. They sacked John Elway 6 times in that Super Bowl, and they also forced 4 turnovers, including 2 interceptions, in another shaky performance for John Elway's Denver Broncos. And the 49ers really capping off their dynasty with a really impressive run in that postseason in 1989, really clinching just not only their dynasty, but just so many great players really either hitting the heights of their careers or just beginning the start to their Hall of Fame careers as well. So just a tremendous season by George Seifert, Mike Holmgren, and all of his staff, really just developing and maintaining the 49ers chemistry after a bit of a shaky 10-6 season the year before in 1988, even though they did make that Super Bowl run against the Cincinnati Bengals. An incredible testament to George Seifert and his accomplishments in his first year as the San Francisco 49ers head coach.
The 49ers finished the regular season 14-2, and we're about to embark on the most dominant playoff run in NFL history.
The 49ers in the league's top offense against the Vikings in the #1 defense. The survivor reaches the NFL's Final Four.
Only the strong survive, baby. That's what we're here for. Kick their ass. That's what we live for, baby. Who can outdo who?
The #1 ranked Viking defense registered 71 sacks in 1989, one shy of the NFL record. Against the 49ers, they came up empty.
Goes across the middle. It is complete to Rice. Rice to the 45. He's to the 50. He breaks through.
Jerry Rice took Joe Montana's third pass 72 yards for a score. Montana was on target early, firing 4 touchdown passes in the first half.
Has to roll out to the right. Looking to throw. Can't find anybody. Goes for the end zone. Jones! Touchdown! Rolling to the right. Throws to the end zone. It's caught for a touchdown. 49ers, John Taylor.
You put up 41 points on the #1 defense in the league, and, you know, that's an eye-opener right there.
You know, we were pretty good then.
We have the Los Angeles Rams and the 49ers going at it. They vie today for the right to go to the Super Bowl in New Orleans.
3 and out, baby. 3 and out.
In the NFC Championship against the Rams, Seifert's defense led the way.
Fagan, we're all over Everett. The 49er entire defensive wall was in his face. And Everett is hit just as he throws the ball. Knocked him down as he released. Here's Everett dropping back, this time really under pressure. Had to throw that one kind of backpedaling and off his heels. Now they own this ball game right now because the Rams are just almost conceding physically. Everett steps back. Now he goes down without even being touched. Boy, is he hearing footsteps. Haley and Roberts were there, but they never touched him. He just ate the ground. Yeah, hit the deck.
The offensive game plan called for the NFL's best receiver to become a blocker.
Rice gets a key block.
Just physically dominating the Rams. Every block they throw is knocking people down. They're tackling harder, they're blocking harder. There's something about this team that in playoff games does raise it up.
The so-called finesse 49ers were dominating the NFC Championship with power football.
Rathman out to the 30, and he runs over Jerry Gray.
The play of Joe Montana bordered on the divine. All seeing, all knowing.
Montana just knows where everybody's going to gotta get it to the end zone. He does! It's a touchdown to John Taylor! Oh my, what a pass completion!
He hasn't thrown a ball harder than that all year. Montana's day, 26 of 30, 262 yards, 2 touchdowns.
And the celebrating begins. The San Francisco 49ers are going to their 2nd consecutive Super Bowl.
You can start heating up the gumbo.
Yeah! Gumbo, here we come to New Orleans! New Orleans, we coming, baby!
With the 3rd coach in history to go to the Super Bowl, his first year as a head coach. Don McCafferty with Baltimore, Red Miller with Denver were the other 2.
In the quest for a 4th championship, the superstitious Seifert had become his owner's 4-leaf clover.
I know you're highly superstitious. Did you have any kind of good luck charms hanging around here today?
George. he was the best luck charm I could have.
Before the start of Super Bowl 24, Tom Rathman delivered an impromptu speech.
We're kind of standing there and, you know, nobody was saying anything, so, you know, I'm like, okay, well, we know we're the best.
We know we're the best team! Let's just go out and prove it today. We gotta play hard, play within your limits. Let's go out and kick some out of here.
But Rathman's confident words belied an inner doubt.
Going into that game, I felt that we weren't going to win for some reason. Just didn't have a good vibe.
That surprises me. Like, I felt pretty sure we were going to win the game.
George Seifert's uncharacteristic optimism had less to do with his red-hot quarterback and more to do with the fact that a lucky sweater he forgot to pack arrived in the mail the day before.
The sweater was given to me by the lady that I worked with as a Christmas present the year before, but I would wear it all the time, and I needed that security, I guess. It's like the little kid with his blanket. I needed my sweater, so they did have to go get that sweater.
He led all NFC running backs in receptions this year with 73.
Seifert may have had his lucky sweater, but during the pregame introductions, his luck would run out. After Rathman was introduced, the team headed for the sidelines, leaving Seifert to enter alone.
You believe this? The team forgot about Seifert. Old Lonesome George.
With the most wins of any head coach in his first season, George.
Although his entrance on football's grand stage had fizzled, Seifert's team was about to explode.
Black 59 Razor! Black 59 Razor! 49-7.
On the 49ers' opening possession, Jerry Rice landed a telling blow by surviving one.
The thing that we had noticed about the safeties, they didn't wrap up. They tried to deliver the blow. Atwater tried to unload on me. and I was able to bounce off that and score a touchdown.
A closer look at the play shows Montana's mastery of the West Coast offense. Tom Rathman was Montana's primary receiver on the play. Montana's second look was at tight end Brent Jones. His third to Jerry Rice, who was covered over the middle. He then checked his fourth read, John Taylor, on the opposite side, before coming back to the now open Rice.
Just complete control of the offense, precision, knowing where the third and fourth receivers are. It's a clinic.
They were a pretty good defense. I had the fewest points scored against them throughout the regular season. Fewest points scored against them, and we put up 55 points.
Launches it for the end zone. Jerry Wright.
Everything was just as sharp and as precise as I could ever imagine.
Perfect pass to Jerry Wright.
There were times when I would look and I'd be in awe myself of some of the things that they were doing. Think about Joe and the precision with which he did everything. You don't see that. I don't know if I've seen it since.
On a rare play when Montana was off target, Rathman made a sensational catch, setting up the first of his 2 short yardage touchdowns, an achievement that left him unfazed.
A lot of people say, oh, what was it like scoring a touchdown in the Super Bowl? Nah, I don't know. I mean, just another play. It wasn't that important to me to score a touchdown. I mean, I could have been throwing a block on a play. I mean, the bottom line is win and win as a team.
Throws for the end zone. Taylor. Touchdown 49.
With a Super Bowl record 5 touchdown passes, the choice of an MVP was as simple as a 1980s dot matrix printout.
Joe Montana could very well be his 3rd Super Bowl MVP award. The 49ers have brought the quality of football in the NFL to really a new level.
What I remember from the Super Bowl, you got grown men, and it's just like we are little kids again.
The boy is going to party tonight.
You have macho guys, and all of a sudden, we able to just show our emotions like that. You know, you see the tears, and you see everybody just hugging each other, and you see the coaches, and you see the owner just running around like a little kid.
Damn you. Congratulations for everything.
That's something I'll never forget.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll tell you what, I'm happy.
For George Seifert, the final minutes of Super Bowl 24 would also leave some indelible images.
It's vivid in my mind. You know, towards the end of the game, Don Griffin and Tim McKyer are standing back to back, yelling, you know, back to back.
Back to back. Number one.
And then I'll never forget looking at Roger Craig and Roger saying, yeah, three-peat. We ought to three-peat.
Three-peat. Three-peat. Go for the three-peat.
And I'm thinking as a coach, you got to be kidding me. We had just gone through this season and we won this Super Bowl, and now he's already talking about next year in three-peat.
We're not even satisfied. We want to get 3. That's right.
I got enough pressure to deal with.
We can do it again. We can do it again.
And that's all that's going through my mind is, my God, they're already talking about next season.
Why don't we make it 3 times? Hey, that's what I said.
Next year, the Super Bowl in Tampa. 49ers already favored to win that one.
Before facing the next season, Seifert still hoped to achieve one more goal at the end of Super Bowl 24.
The game is over, and now the players pick the coach up to be carried off the field. You can think of all the coaches, you know, being picked up and carried off. There's Bill Walsh with his finger up in the air, number 1, you know. I'm standing there and I'm thinking, you know, here comes my moment of glory through this whole deal. You know, finally, after this tough season, I'm going to get carried off the field, and I'll have these pictures that my kids can see forever. And I even put myself in position, ready to be carried.
Young kneels down again, that's it.
I'm kind of standing around, you know, waiting, you know, who's going to pick me up, you know, and everybody just kind of ran off the field, you know.
And it's over. San Francisco, 55, and the Denver Broncos, 10.
Well, Lonesome George, you know, to this day.
49ers, in one of the greatest football games ever played by one team, become the first team to win back-to-back Super Bowls since the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Thank you to a man that came in a situation that wasn't exactly easy, and he is your coach.
In the spring of 2006, the 49ers gathered in Las Vegas for a reunion of their Super Bowl teams.
We're going to take care of some unfinished business that goes back 16 years.
At our party in Las Vegas, I was surrounded by a lot of the players, and they said, just relax, George, and go with the flow.
16 years later.
The next thing I knew, I was hoisted up, and they were carrying me throughout the ballroom where we were having our party, and we were on tuxedos and all. And I felt kind of foolish in a way. I was, doing the victory sign and going through the whole. But I figured, what the heck? Many of those people, I'll never see them again. And to be there and have all of those great teams and great players together, to be part of that, in many ways, it's more special to me.
Welcome back, everybody, to 100 Years of the NFL, a historical journey. I hope you all really enjoyed watching the 49ers postseason highlights of their run to Super Bowl 24, ending with that convincing 55-10 victory over the Denver Broncos that got the 49ers their final Super Bowl of the 1980s, capping off a tremendous decade of drama and thrills, as the Monday Night Football introduction from Frank Gifford at the beginning of our broadcast. Just an incredible decade for 49ers fans, and it kept going at least for another decade with Steve Young and George Seifert kind of continuing the same energy that Bill Walsh first gave the San Francisco 49ers at the beginning of the 1980s, and it was George Seifert and Steve Young who kept it going after Joe Montana and Bill Walsh left their legacies with the San Francisco 49ers from the 1980s, and Seifert and Young doing their efforts to keep the 49ers Super Bowl chances alive with another Super Bowl in Super Bowl XXIX against the San Diego Chargers, and that one to cap off their 5 Super Bowl titles in a 14-year stretch. So just an incredible run by the San Francisco 49ers over that stretch. But what we're going to do here to wrap up our broadcast here of the 1989 San Francisco 49ers, we're going to take a look at the final statistics of some of the key offensive and defensive players here for the San Francisco 49ers. And then after that, we will introduce the next team that we will cover here in our 100 Years of the NFL, a historical journey. So let's go ahead and let's wrap up here with the final statistics here for some of the 49ers' key offensive and defensive players. So let's start out here, of course, with their quarterbacks. So, of course, as I mentioned, Joe Montana and Steve Young both received a lot of playing time for how George Seifert handled the quarterback controversy after that 1988 season was a real downer, with the 49ers only winning 10 games. Seifert and Mike Holmgren did a really good job knowing if Montana was hurt, Steve Young would be the next man up, and both of them just performed incredibly well during the 1989 season here. As Joe Montana, as we talked about, he won league MVP that season in 1989, but he passed for a shade over 3,500 yards during the regular season, 26 passing touchdowns to 8 interceptions, and he also rushed for 3 touchdowns during the regular season. And as I mentioned as well, with the high completion percentage for Montana and Steve Young that season, Montana completed 70.2% of his passes during the regular season that year. So just an incredible season for Joe Montana. A little bit above a 3-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio, and capping off his stretch of 4 Super Bowls of the 1980s, winning both Super Bowl MVP and league MVP in 1989, and also winning another MVP in 1990 to almost finish his career with the San Francisco 49ers. So just an incredible last few years that Joe Montana had playing at the height of his career, with some great statistics and just still being that great leader that he was for that San Francisco 49ers offense. Steve Young, on the other hand, though, as well, he had a really impressive season in a backup role here for the 49ers. He passed just over 1,000 yards during the regular season. He had 8 passing touchdowns to only 3 interceptions, and he also rushed for 2 touchdowns during the regular season, and he completed 69.6% of his passes during the regular season as well. So just as a backup, just Young really sold out for 49ers fans to really know that once Joe Montana was no longer going to be the quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, Steve Young said, "This is what I have to give you." And just even though it was just a few glimmers here and there with Montana receiving most of the starts, he did an exceptional job that season in 1989, really filling in and going 3-0 in all of his 3 starts that he made that season for the San Francisco 49ers. So just a really solid duo quarterback scenario for Mike Holmgren and George Seifert to really go on that season in 1989. But we also talked about the San Francisco 49ers running game as well that season in 1989. Of course, we talked about with Roger Craig getting most of the workload that season for the 49ers rushing attack. He just rushed over 1,000 yards during the 1989 season, 6 rushing touchdowns, and he also contributed in the receiving game with 49 receptions for 473 yards and 1 receiving touchdown to earn a Pro Bowl honor for Roger Craig. So a really impressive season for Roger Craig in that regard. And his fullback, Tom Rathman, he contributed really well in the receiving department as well that season. He had 73 receptions for 616 yards, and he had a receiving touchdown himself, and he also had 305 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown for Tom Rathman. So just a really well-used system for Roger Craig and Tom Rathman, both of them really good receiving backs and just good downhill runners as well to really just kind of generate some balance on that 49ers offense during that 1989 season. As I mentioned, they were the 10th ranked rushing offense that season, and Roger Craig and Tom Rathman got most of the workload for that regard for the 49ers rushing attack. And then also we can't let out the big key receiving threats here for the San Francisco 49ers in 1989. Of course, we'll start out with Jerry Rice's numbers, that he really had a very productive season in 1989. He had 82 catches for 1,483 yards and scored 17 receiving touchdowns for the 49ers offense that year. And in the receiving yards category and the receiving touchdowns category, he actually led the NFL in both of those categories for that season for Jerry Rice in 1989. So just that really just set the stage for what his career was going to be. I mean, he hadn't really hit his, career years yet as he would have in the 1990s, but just the way his career started out in the 80s, winning Super Bowl MVP and Super Bowl XXIII, and then just matching it up with just an incredible season in 1989 and postseason on top of that. Just an all-around great year for the greatest receiver in the history of the National Football League in Jerry Rice. But then we also talked about with his other receiver next to him, John Taylor. He had a really career year himself that season in 1989 as well. John Taylor, he had 60 catches for 1,077 yards and 10 receiving touchdowns for the 49ers that year, and that was career year for John Taylor in receiving yards and receiving touchdowns. So you had Jerry Rice, who led the league in receiving yards and receiving touchdowns, and John Taylor happened to have his only season that he broke over 1,000 yards and had at least 10 touchdowns during the regular season as well. So just both of those huge prize wide receivers from lower FCS schools. As I mentioned with John Taylor from Delaware State and Jerry Rice from Mississippi Valley State. Just incredible steals for both of those receivers to become huge parts of that 49ers dynasty in the later years of the 1980s. Just incredible jobs by both of those receivers for San Francisco. And then also tight end Brent Jones also contributed really well during that 1989 season. He had 40 catches for 500 receiving yards and 4 receiving touchdowns during the regular season, and he added 3 receiving touchdowns during the 49ers postseason as well. So a really productive year for Brent Jones. Not good enough for a Pro Bowl, but still a very productive season before earning 4 straight Pro Bowl honors with Steve Young as his quarterback during the mid-1990s. So just a really impressive season by that 49ers offense. As I mentioned, they were the #1 ranked offense in the NFL that season in 1989. And, of course, we also talked about the great offensive line that they had. We talked about Guy McIntyre, Jesse Sapolu, and a couple others as well, Harris Barton as well, Bruce Collie, and just all those guys on that offensive line just really stabilizing that great offense for the San Francisco 49ers. And Guy McIntyre actually was the only offensive lineman for the San Francisco 49ers to make a Pro Bowl that season. But an all-around great year by the San Francisco 49ers offense. Now, remember when I was talking to you about the 49ers defense under George Seifert in this season in 1989, there were really no set starters for the San Francisco 49ers in 1989. There were some players that were all 16-game starters in some positions, as we talked about with the Hall of Famers, of course, of Charles Haley and Ronnie Lott really patrolling that 49ers defense for much of this season in 1989. But for some of the other positions, it was almost kind of like a plug-in and play scenario for George Seifert because he just had so much talent on his defense in 1989. It just allowed him to really mix things up a little bit and just kind of create some interesting defensive game plans against the other teams the 49ers played during the regular season. So what we're going to do actually here is I'm going to just list off the names of some of the big players in each positional group: the defensive line, the linebacker unit, and the secondary unit for the 49ers, and I'll give you their overall statistics for how well these players did during the 1989 season for the San Francisco 49ers. So let's start out with the 49ers defensive line first. We talked about Pierce Holt a little bit, really helping out that 49ers defensive line. He had a forced fumble actually that season in 1989. We also talked about Kevin Fagan a little bit earlier with his contributions to the defensive line. They had another player named Danny Stubbs. We also talked about Larry Roberts, and another defensive lineman they had was Pete Kugler. And remember when I was talking about Pete Kugler, when the 49ers drafted him in 1981, he was only one of, I believe, 5 49ers players that were around for all 4 of the San Francisco 49ers Super Bowls that they won during the 1980s. As I was saying, with Kugler stretching his career along the 49ers dynasty train, he became probably the veteran of that 49ers defensive line in 1989. So between Holt, Fagan, Stubbs, Roberts, and Kugler, all 5 of them combined for 28.5 total sacks that season for the 49ers and 4 fumble recoveries between the 5 of them as well. So a really impressive job by that 49ers defensive front, really delivering and performing really well for the San Francisco 49ers for much of the season, really helping out that passing defense for the San Francisco 49ers that season. So a really good job there on George Seifert's part in the defensive line unit for their linebacking core for the 49ers that season. We talked about, of course, Charles Haley, of course, the Hall of Fame linebacker that he was. He had 3 forced fumbles actually during the 19 1989 season, and he had a return touchdown actually off of one of those fumbles that he forced during the regular season. We also talked about linebacker Bill Romanowski as well a little bit. We talked about how he kind of stretched his career really being the veteran linebacker, but he was a very young linebacker with the 49ers during the later years of the 1980s. But he had a forced fumble himself, and he also had an interception during the 1989 season. So a good start there for Romanowski's career. They also had a linebacker named Mike Walter, who was a backup linebacker to some of the other big linebackers that were key on the 49ers in 1989. We talked about Matt Millen. He had an interception for the 49ers defense that season. Also, they had another linebacker named Keith DeLong. He had an interception during the season. And they also had Keena Turner. We also talked about him when he was drafted in 1980. He, like Pete Kugler, really kind of stretched their careers off that 10-year run from 1980 to 1989 to help the 49ers out in a big way. And as I mentioned, he did have an interception during the 89 season. They had another backup linebacker that saw a marginal playing time like Mike Walter named Antonio Goss. He was also a part of that 49ers linebacking unit. So between the, trying to count here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, between the 7 linebackers that they had to play that season for the 49ers, they combined for 12.5 total sacks that season and 8 fumble recoveries between the linebackers for the 49ers defense as well. And as I mentioned, of course, really the big starters on that linebacking unit for the 49ers for much of the season was Charles Haley, who received most of the playing time. Matt Millen got most of the playing time. Keena Turner and Romanowski kind of, shifted in a little bit to start. But as for Mike Walter, Keith DeLong, and Antonio Goss, really limited time between the 3 of them, but still very impressive performances by the 49ers defensive line unit and their linebacker unit. And now we talk about their secondary unit right now here, as we talked about, of course, with Ronnie Lott, of course, the Hall of Fame safety, patrolling the back 7 of the 49ers defense that season. We also talked about Chet Brooks. He actually had a sack that season and a fumble recovery playing in the safety position that he played for the 49ers. We also talked about Don Griffin, the great cornerback that he was during the 49ers' later years of the 1980s. He had a fumble recovery during the 1989 season. We also talked about Eric Wright, who was also a product of that 1981 draft class with Ronnie Lott. Both of them were big fixtures of that 49ers secondary unit for all the 1980s. They also had another cornerback that was key for their 49ers defense that season. He was actually a rookie that year for the 49ers. His name was Johnny Jackson. He had a fumble recovery during the regular season as well. We also talked about Tim McKyer a little while ago, about some of the more recognizable names of the 49ers secondary unit during the later 80s and 90s. But then they also had 2 other defensive backs that were also a part of that 49ers secondary unit. They had a guy named Darryl Pollard and also another defensive back named Tom Holmo, and they, of course, were more backups to Ronnie Lott, Chet Brooks, Don Griffin, Eric Wright, and Tim McKyer. It was really those players that received much of the starts for the 49ers secondary during that 1989 season. But between all of those defensive backs for the 49ers, I'm going to count here one more time, actually. I'm sorry about this. Lott, Brooks, and Wright, Jackson, McKyer, Holmo, Pollard. I believe it's 8 defensive backs that I named off for you there. Between the 8 of them, they combined for 17 total interceptions, though, between them. And I believe it was only Ronnie Lott and Charles Haley, I think, that received Pro Bowls for that 49ers defense during the 1989 season. So just, as I mentioned, George Seifert was kind of more of like a plug-in and play kind of defense that he had during that 1989 season. It really wasn't as set of starters that they had during the 1984 season, when I talked about with Dan McLemore also being in that group for the 49ers. It was really four of them, with Lott, Eric Wright, Dan McLemore, and of course the other cornerback as well that they had during the 1980s as well, during the early years of the 1980s that you saw at the beginning of the broadcast when Dwight Clark was talking about how the 49ers defense really stepped up during the early years and was able to keep it going in the later years of the 1980s when George Seifert started to really work his magic on that 49ers defense. And then right before we talk about our next team here for 100 years of the NFL, a historical journey, let's go ahead and let's talk about the 49ers special teams key players here real quick here. So we talked about with Mike Kofer when we were talking about what a big signing he was when he was a backup to Morton Anderson during the 1987 season when the NFL was on strike that year and only played 15 games. But Kofer turned out to be a huge part of that 49ers offense during the 1989 season. Kofer, he converted 29 of 36 field goals for the 49ers during the regular season, and he made 49 of 51 extra points to lead the NFL with 136 points scored to earn All-Pro honors for Mike Kofer during that 1989 season. So just a tremendous season that Mike Kofer had. You think about it, if he made like one more field goal and was 30 of 36, that's 5 out of every 6 field goals that he made. So just a really impressive accuracy streak that Kofer had. And as I mentioned, he was a big part of that 49ers offense when they bogged down, but still was in Mike Kofer's range to get some much needed points for their offense. That was the number 1 ranked offense in the National Football League, and Mike Kofer was a huge part of that for the 49ers offensive attack. And we also talked about punter Barry Helton a little bit earlier when he was drafted in the 1988 draft. A little bit of a soft season for Barry Helton during the 1989 season. He only had 55 punts for the 49ers during the regular season, and he averaged 40.5 yards per punt. So a little bit low on the yards per punt average, a little bit mediocre to say the best for Barry Helton. But the longest one that he had, though, during the regular season was from 56 yards out. He just kind of struggled a little bit with consistency, I guess, that year for the 49ers. And actually one of his punts was blocked during the regular season, but still a very impressive member of that 49ers special teams unit and a really important asset for George Seifert to rely on to pin their opponents back to really help that 49ers defense that year. And then we also talked about one of the 49ers backup running backs who turned out to be one of their primary returners during the 1989 season. We talked about Terrence Flagler a little bit when he saw a little bit of playing time during the regular season, kind of filling out that running back by committee in some games for the 49ers during the regular season. But Terrence Flagler, though, he had 32 kick returns that season in 1989 for 643 yards. So he averaged pretty good distance during his kick returns when he was sent back for kickoffs from the 49ers' point of view. And he also contributed with a rushing touchdown during the regular season as well for the 49ers, and his longest kick return during the regular season was 41 yards. So a pretty solid year for Terrence Flagler. Of course, he didn't really accomplish much outside really being a special teams threat and a backup running back, of course, when they had Roger Craig and Tom Rathman to help carry the mail on the 49ers offense. But still a very impressive season for a young Terrence Flagler to really just find his position on that 49ers team that season in 1989. And then, of course, we also talked about wide receiver John Taylor, who had a really career year as a wide receiver, but he also did pretty good in the punt return position as well for the 49ers in 1989. He had 36 punt returns that season for 417 yards, and that's an average of 11.6 yards per return, and the longest one he had was 37 yards. So again, just another really impressive season for John Taylor, really kind of still separating it out a little bit. Of course, he really started early in his career as a primary punt returner, but then once he really showcased his abilities at wide receiver, he and Jerry Rice became that huge combo for many years with Joe Montana and Steve Young during the later 80s and early 90s years. So just a really solid all-around team here for the 1989 49ers. Of course, tremendous cap to their year of the dynasty. Of course, we talked about with the Pittsburgh Steelers in the 1970s, and the 49ers, of course, owned the 1980s with their 4 Super Bowl titles, capping it off with a 14-2 season and a dramatic postseason run that landed them in the driver's seat, really to begin the 1990s on a strong note and really usher in that next era when Steve Young took over for Joe Montana during the early years of the 90s after Joe Montana struggled with injuries. But George Seifert and Bill Walsh, just incredible credit for them getting that 49ers dynasty out from nowhere after really struggling during the later years of the 1970s, and really just showcasing how well that team was going to be over the next 2 decades with 2 Hall of Fame quarterbacks in Joe Montana and Steve Young. Tremendous credit to this 49ers team and the 49ers management for doing their jobs in forming one of the best dynasties in the history of the National Football League. So that's going to go ahead and that's going to do it for our broadcast here of the 1989 49ers. And as I have mentioned countless times at the end of our broadcast, if you have an idea or a story of your favorite player or a team that you really kind of want me to talk about a little bit more on 100 Years of the NFL, A Historical Journey, feel free to shoot a comment on my YouTube page, on my Facebook account, or even my Twitter page if you're so kind to do that. If you want to hear more about your favorite teams or your favorite players, just feel free to land me a comment, and I'll be sure to get that in at some point down the road here as we continue our journey across the National Football League here. So, as I mentioned, of course, as well, we are going to bring back actually into the AFC North in our next broadcast, actually, because as I mentioned, we took a little bit of a break after we talked about the 1981 Bengals. I wanted to introduce us a little bit into the NFC West. Well, we're going to cap off our AFC North division with our next broadcast on 100 Years of the NFL, A Historical Journey, as we're going to talk about the 1959 Baltimore Colts. That's right, we're going to talk about Johnny Unitas leading the Baltimore Colts to 2 straight NFL championships in 1958 and 1959, kind of similar to what the 49ers did in 1988 and 1989. So we're going to talk about the 1959 Baltimore Colts in our next broadcast on 100 Years of the NFL, A Historical Journey. I hope everybody really has a great night, and I hope everybody really continues to stay safe during these difficult times.
ABC Sports thanks you for watching this presentation of the National Football League.